Good morning. Good morning. Okay. Just trying to make sure I have everything set up right. Um, Hope everybody's day is going wonderful. I'm just getting everything set. Um, I am trying to make sure that everything is going right with something new that I'm doing. And so we'll see by this live whether or not it is. Um, I pulled the account off private for a little while and we'll see if it works. Um, and I know that this is the topic that we've kind of been on for the last couple of days. It might be getting a little bit boring. I'm doing this because I want to see if I'm getting the same amount of viewers with the same thing, right? Just to double check something that I changed up to see if it's going to like work the same way or if it's going to decrease my viewership. So I wanted to grab something that I had used previously and know the amount of viewers or roughly the amount of viewers I'm going to get with it. Oh, maybe I already invited them. I do not want to invite people 2 or 3 different times, right? Um, so I hope everybody's doing okay. I'm sorry if the topic might be getting a little bit there for some people, but we kind of end up switching it up half the time anyways, and it becomes a few different things. It's more just the background and the marker of kind of what we're going over and not necessarily the only things that we touch on. Um, as I am getting started and getting everything shared out, I want to remind everybody, and I'll probably do it again once we get to a point that there's actually, a lot of people in here, just so that I can make sure that anybody new coming in has an understanding that TikTok is everybody with 1,000 followers, a live space. And what you do in your live space, it's your space. You get to set the boundaries. And so the boundaries within my space are this is an educational content platform. I will teach you how race has been debunked and doesn't exist. And I will teach you why we're supposed to be nurturing and communal and what things that, are really actually positive for us as a species. I'm coming in here because to me, I don't believe that education should be gate kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall. And I don't think that it should be gate kept behind language that even those of us with extensive degrees sometimes have to go and Google half the words, right? And so because of that, I want to make sure that education is more accessible for everybody. This, of course, is a very basic education. Let's see if Sarah can talk today. This, of course, is very basic in its education, and it is way more about having people find out some information and then go Google it yourself, right? Go find the deeper points of that information yourself, because I feel that that's how we learn better, right? We learn better when we're actually invested in what we're learning and we're really kind of getting into it and we're doing our own studying and are doing our own finding. And so I'm not here to give you all of the information. I'm here to give you little pieces of the information. And I have a website that you can go to that you can actually find out more information. It's in my profile. It has like bibliographies of all the things that we talk about, right? So if you are looking for more information, you can go to that website and you can search around and you can find an article. And then using that article, you can find more based off of that article, right? So I'm not here to give you a college degree. Unfortunately, that is still something you have to pay for, right? I am here so that information that is really gatekept by academia, that really isn't common knowledge and really isn't out there, can actually get out there on a better scale. In here, I talk a lot about how we are nurturing and communal as a species and how we should be interacting on a more healthier way. And what are the more healthier ways that we can act with each other? I also talk about how the rise of violence is only 10,000 years old. We talk about many of these different things. This is an act of love for me. And I want to make sure that I'm treated in the same way. Don't come at me nasty, right? That's just not appropriate. Those are my boundaries within my space. I don't deal well with racism. You will not like my response. Race has been debunked. It is a colonial construct. It does not exist. Racism still exists. Culture and ethnicity still exist. Race does not exist. And we really need to be doing more to try and get rid of the racism in our society. So if you're coming at me with racist comments, you're not really going to like my response. The same thing is you'd have to know what culture I am to decide that it's cultural appropriation, Joshua. You have a perception of who I am based nothing on me. And you would have to know what culture I am to actually decide whether or not I'm culturally appropriating. But I don't deal with phobias based on gender and desire well either. And I don't deal with phobias based on religion. I don't really want to hear about your God. Your God is a narcissist who creates war and likes death and kills children. And I really don't want to deal with him in here. I also don't want to deal with your Islamophobia, your anti Semitism. Like, so keep all of that stuff out of my space. This is my space, right? Um, and the other thing within this space is that if you disagree with me, you're absolutely capable of disagreeing with me, right? I need you to tell me why. I'm bringing facts and I have stuff that backs up my facts. So if you think that some of my facts are wrong, please bring me the information that shows me different. I am always looking for more information. I believe that humans should constantly be learning. And so I am constantly learning. I am not the be all and end all of any source. And I don't know everything. I'm constantly, constantly, constantly. And so within that, I ask that you respect that you respect the boundaries that are set and you act like a healthy and safe human being for other people within my space. Because again, it is my space. TikTok will give you a space if you do 1,000 followers as well. If your content is something that actually gives you access to 1,000 followers, right? So TikTok will give you your own space. And if you want to go and spread your ick, you can spread your ick elsewhere, just not in here, right? So when we are dealing with the different things that we're dealing with within society, right? There's a lot of different stuff that people really aren't understanding, right? And see you later, nothing. Um, when we're looking at these things, these are kind of some of the things that I want to go ahead and touch on today, right? One of the things that we really need to touch on as we're looking at this first is going to be a couple of definitions. The first thing that I want to touch on is the definition of immigration, migration, and colonization, right? These are things that most of us don't really understand the definitions of. And so it's important that we get a clear perspective of what these words mean when we're talking about how these words interact with the rest of humanity. So the first one I want to talk about is migration. Migration is something that people do in either a pattern or something that they do when they're moving into a space that nobody occupies currently. So if you are migrating across the globe at 50,000 years ago, and there are not people in that space already, because there are other humans on the planet besides us at 50,000 years ago, and there are not people in that space already, you are migrating into a new space. We also see migration as one of those things that is you can have yearly migration patterns if you belong to a culture who does hunter gathering as opposed to collecting. Hunter gathering means that you move with the seasons, and collecting means you stay in one space and you go out during the seasons and you bring it back to your space, right? So if you are part of a culture that hunter gathers instead of collects, then you might have a migration pattern where you move one place in the spring and another place in the summer and another place in the fall and another place in the winter. And this is one of the ways that you're able to get your food sustenance, right? So these are two different ways that we look at migration and what migration is. The next thing on this list is immigration. Immigration is when you're moving into a space that already has people and a culture within it, and you are becoming a part of the culture there. So if somebody is immigrating to the United States, that person immigrating to the United States is becoming a part of the culture of the United States. They might become a US citizen. They might, start a business within the US. They might, join politics within the US, right? They become a part of the United States culture. That is immigration. When somebody immigrates, they move to a place that there are already people in, and they become a part of the culture that is already there. When somebody is migrating, migration, or not migrating, sorry, when somebody is colonizing, colonization is moving into a space that is already occupying and replacing the culture within that space with your own culture. And this is mostly done through force. This is mostly done through violence. So when somebody is colonizing a space, they're going to move into that space. They're going to take over the culture that is already there. They're going to usually try and harm the people that are there to impose their government and their cultural ideas on that space. So when we are looking at that, please don't just repeat yourself. I've already told you that out of Africa is debunked. So please don't repeat yourself over and over and over again, bud. So, when we are looking at colonization, colonization is when people are moving into a space that is already occupied and they're imposing their culture and their government on that space. These are the definitions of these three words. A couple other definitions that I want to go over. I just went over the difference between hunter gatherer and collector. They are the same types of people, the same groups of people usually. They just perform their quest for sustenance in different ways. The other thing that I want to go over is the difference between tribe and band. Many people think of things like tribal, indicating people who are hunter gatherers. So there are many people who are tribes who are actually collectors, right? Tribe is a community based on genetic lineage. So your citizenship is based on your genetic lineage within that community. You might have a matriarch who has 10 daughters, and those 10 daughters form 10 clans. And your belonging to that nation is based on your descendancy through those clans and to that matriarch. A band is a community not based on genetic lineage. So you can have several different genetic groups within that community. We see this frequently within paleoanthropology when we're looking at different species of humans that we're all living together, right? These are bands because they are communities not based on genetic lineage. So these are just a couple of definitions that I want to talk about really early on so that we can have these definitions out of the way. And of course, we might have to go over these definitions again as people come and people go when new information needs to come to light, right? Humans have always separated themselves in some way, actually, and we're going to go over that. So, when we're looking at decolonization, we need to first realize what colonization is, which we just went over, and we need to realize how we get to a colonized standpoint. And so, let's go ahead and talk about how we get to a colonized standpoint. When we look at the history of human, we're looking at something that comes from written word. History means written story. So everything after we started writing stuff down, and currently the accepted period of time that we started writing stuff down is cuneiform. There are forms of writing that predate cuneiform, but academia and Western science and Western thought in its own self and its own hubris only goes back to cuneiform. They ignore hieroglyphics and things like that. So when we are looking at this start of history, we start history at the start of cuneiform, the start of written word. Things that are prehistory happen before that. Now, that means that history changes in different spaces. What is prehistory in a different space is along a different timeline. It doesn't become history until those who are writing things down are moving into that space, right? The written word moves into that space. So you might have groups that still don't have what we would consider by the correct definition to be history. They would still be on the prehistory scale. When we are looking at prehistory, when we are looking at who we were prior to the point that we start documenting who we are, start writing who we are down, we can see what and who we are and what cultures we're living in, how we're migrating and how we're moving, and the different things that we're doing through archaeological record. With the archaeological record, you can determine what somebody's culture was. You can determine the genetics of a person. You can determine how they lived. You can determine who they interacted with. You can determine how they migrated, moved across the land, where they went to, right? Um, when we're looking at that, we're seeing that. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by chat just a little bit. Which, if you come into my lives, you know can happen. And I'm really, 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 really trying not to. Now, as an archaeologist and an anthropologist, I take a look at what the archaeological record states about human patterns of behavior prior to history. And when we look at human patterns of behavior prior to history, I tend to take it back prior to who we are actually. I tend to take it back to Homo erectus, Homo neanderthal, Homo heidelbergensis. Yet when we get to Homo sapien, we can see that prior to 10,000 years ago, there is not violence among Homo sapiens. There's not even violence between Homo sapiens and other groups of human. Anything that has the genus Homo, so Homo neanderthalis, Homo denisovan, Homo erectus, these are all human because Homo was Latin for human. Does mean the same in Greek, but in Latin, it means human. And most science is based on Latin terms, not Greek terms. So when we are looking at the different groups of human that Homo sapien comes in contact with this Homo sapien is moving across the planet. There's no evidence that we were killing these people. There's no evidence that we were harming these people. In fact, many times the evidence shows that we were intermixing with these people, that we were learning from these people, and we were becoming a part of these people's communities. Again, this would be immigration. If we're moving into a space that is already peopled and we are becoming a part of the present community there, right? So, when we're looking at the way that Homo sapien is moving across the planet and interacting with these people, we do not have an evidence of violence between Homo sapien and any other group of human in the archaeological record. We actually do not have an evidence of violence that is definitive in the archaeological record until 10,000 years ago. Everything within the archaeological record prior to 10,000 years ago is we have about 2,000 individuals that we have gotten from the archaeological record. That doesn't mean 2,000 bones, that means the bones of 2,000 individuals. And within those 2,000 individuals, we can see roughly 2% of injuries that could possibly be attributed to violence. Now, what do I mean by could possibly be attributed to violence? If you see a skull that looks like it's been caved in with a rock, right? You can't tell if the rock that caved that skull in was being wielded by another hand or if a rock fell from the cave wall and hit somebody in the head and that's how they died. You can't tell if they were out and had a landslide fall on them, right? So if it's definitive violence, it is something that cannot be attributed to anything but violence. If it cannot be attributed only to violence, it is not definitive violence. So prior to 10,000 years ago, there is 2% of things that could possibly be attributed to violence, but they are not definitive violent acts. At 10,000 years ago, we start to see definitive violent acts in the archaeological record, and we start to see that those definitive violent acts rise, right? That the presence of things that could even possibly be attributed to violence rise, and what is definitive starts to take a presence in the archaeological record, and we start to see definitive violence happening. Again, my website is in my bio in widdaord.com, and I have bibliographies for all of this stuff within my website. And you can go and you can find the articles that back all of these statements, and you can do some some deeper digging for yourself so that you can get more information, right? So we see at 10,000 years ago that there is a rise of violence in the archaeological record, and that rise of violence in the archaeological record is let's touch on that. Just one second. That rise of violence in the archaeological record goes up to 18%. Piercings date back to Neanderthal. Nose piercings date back to Neanderthal. This is something that is across all sapiens prior to where we're settling into our spaces. We actually were doing this because before we actually become sapien, right? Like before we're the only species left on this planet. And we see that other humans are doing the same thing. There's piercings of nose, piercings of ears, piercings of lips seen within Neanderthals. There's also tattooing seen 35,000 years ago in a cave in France is our very first evidence of tools for tattooing. So we know that these things predate our current ideas of who is where and what, right? So this is not cultural appropriation. A. B, I am globally mixed and I am indigenous to Turtle Island. So again, this is not cultural appropriation. This is connection. This is ancestral. And this is doing my own homework, my own research, and being an indigenous human being who connects to their ancestors and is trying to uplift voices. So no, this is not a cultural history of piercings that only goes back to certain places. That's not how it works. Really, this goes back to Neanderthal, period. And that is in the archaeological record. So when you try to sit there and go, well, that's only belonging to a certain person, there are things that only belong to a certain person or to a certain group of people. Braids, global. Pre-colonization, braids are global, right? Everybody has braids across the planet. Specific patterning of braiding is specific to certain cultures, and you should not use the specific patterning of braiding that is specific to certain cultures because that is what cultural appropriation is. Tattooing, global. Chin lines are specific to certain nations among Turtle Island, and so you should not be using chin lines. That would be cultural appropriation. I don't belong to any of the nations within Turtle Island that do chin lines, so I would never add chin lines, even though I am Turtle Island indigenous. Okay, so your idea of what is actual cultural appropriation, what is not cultural appropriation, has been really twisted by propaganda. Just to state, right? And I can give you a little bit of information on it, right? But I am not going to be told that I'm appropriating a culture that I belong to, be told that I'm appropriating a culture that I'm part of, anyways, even if it was only in that culture. Okay. So we see that the rise of violence that is definitive is 18 to 20% at 10,000 years ago. And the first thing that we see that is, or one of the first things that we see that's in the archaeological record at 10,000 years ago, right, is there is a site in Kenya where we see 8 people who were massacred in this site. This is one of our very first evidence of things that are very definitively violent. And how we can tell these things are definitively violent is one of them is a pregnant woman who is sitting in a cross-legged position on the ground with her hands bound underneath her pregnant belly, and she's been hit from behind. So this tells us definitively this is the act of one human being against another human being. This is violence. So we see that shift from we can't tell if it's violence, and there's only roughly 2% of it in the archaeological record, to absolute violence, and it's 18 to 20% starting at 10,000 years ago. There's a couple of different shifts in the way we think and what we're doing at 10,000 years ago that gives rise to this. Joshua, you need to stop, man. Again, you don't know me and you don't know who I am, so you can't tell who I am. You're deciding that you're going to tell who I am based on this. There are many people who are white appearing in Black culture. There are many people who are white appearing in Indigenous culture. And you looking at somebody online and deciding that you know is your own fallacy and your own mental health problem. You need to take it elsewhere. You need to stop it. Or you can leave, or you can be muted. But I am Turtle Island Indigenous. Blood quantum is a colonial thing. And I am accepted and claimed and loved by my community. And you don't get to tell that by looking at me. Unless you belong to a nation that I am claiming that I belong to, which you're not because I'm not, then you don't know. All you're doing is running your mouth and being an asshole. You can move it along. It's perfectly acceptable for you to just not talk, right? So, the things that we see along with the rise of violence within the archaeological record are, and it was said in chat, farming, agriculture based on Western thought, monocrop agriculture. The other thing that we see with the rise of violence is the rise of cities based on monocrop agriculture. Now, monocrop agriculture starts probably 15 to 18,000 years ago, is what we're looking at along the Nile. And it really works along the Nile. And the reason that monocrop agriculture works along the Nile and not really anywhere else is because the Nile's yearly floods refertilize the land every year. And so, as the Nile refertilizes the land every year, you can plant a monocrop and it doesn't need to get its nutrients from anywhere else because the Nile's flood has given it all the nutrients it needs. Try this anywhere else and you don't have the Nile's yearly floods, and it works differently. So when they take this and they decide to move it to Mesopotamia, to what we call the Fertile Crescent, right? When they decide to move it to the Fertile Crescent, it doesn't really work as well. Now, there's a city and a river, the Mon River in Jordan, that actually dates back 10,000 years. And its first iteration was 10,000 years ago. It only lasted 300 years in its first iteration because they caused climate destruction in the area. This is our first city that we have in the record that is based on agriculture, monocrop agriculture. And when they move into this space, they're moving into an extremely fertile valley, but they rip up all the fertility from that valley and they replace it with monocrop agriculture. And then they husband. They take their animals up into the hills surrounding in their husbandry. And in doing this, they denude the nutrients of the area. They strip the nutrients of the area. So the monocrops that they're planting don't get nutrients from the soil, because when you rip out all of the different things of the biome and put one thing in there that may not belong there or may belong there, but doesn't have the needed nutrients met from other things, you see that your crops fail. Not only do you see that your crops fail, but when you rip out an entire biome, you end up with desert. Right? We see this happen in California. In the California is settled 1700s, 1800s. And when we start to see the settlement in California, we see that in the settlement of California, that the people along the eastern or western coast of the United States have a really beautiful agricultural program basically going, right? They do controlled burns to try and keep their undergrowth down. The environment and the biome that is developed and tended to in this space is fertile and it blooms. So you see that Europeans come in this area and they're like, well, that's really good land for planting. So let's rip everything out and plant monocrop agriculture. Now, what they do is they rip out the prairies. And what most people don't understand is the prairies go down like 4 feet underground. The root systems of the prairies actually hold all that soil into place, right? And so when they rip out all of the nutrients and all of the prairie and they get rid of the 4 feet that is being held together by the prairies, you see that they replace it with crops that then don't end up living past, you can do this crops for 10 years and then it's not really working because there's no fertility left in the soil. And so then there are no longer planting crops and it becomes a dust bowl. There's a song that goes, think you're going to the sugar bowl, but you're going to the dust bowl. And that's because we really saw this happen during the Depression. This is one of the reasons that the Depression was so hard, was because all of our sugar bowl, all of our farmland was starting to become infertile and turning into dust because of the fact that we had ripped out all the prairie and we ripped out all the nutrients and we had ripped out all the biome. So we see that the same thing happens with Angazol. And so in Angazol, the climate destruction that happens within the 300 years that Angazol is there ruins the area and they have to move on. Now they've replanted Angazol. Angazol is from where Shem from the Bible comes from. Actually, it's the origin of the Israelites. The origin of the Israelites is in Amman in Jordan, right? So when we see that this monocrop agriculture is causing this climate destruction, we decide in our hubris that we're just going to keep doing it, right? And part of this is because we can hoard with monocrop agriculture and we cannot hoard without monocrop agriculture. When we are looking at animistic thought processes, which is what everybody is prior to this, animistic thought process is the belief that you're just a part of the biome, that you're just another animal in the biome, that the trees and the plants and the animals are just as important as you are, and that the earth itself has a soul. The earth itself is its own being and is just as important as you are. You have a niche in the biome, you fit your niche in the biome, and that niche for Homo sapien and for all humans actually is to tend. That niche is to tend the land. That niche is to care for the land. That niche is to care for the animals. And so within animism, we understood this. We understood that we were part of the biome. And so when we were harvesting within animism, we would harvest and take what we needed, but we would leave the rest behind because that meant that the next group could, that the animals could, and that the plant would regrow, right? So when we are looking at that switch into monocrop agriculture, we see that we also get this switch into this idea that instead of we belong to the land because we are a part of the biome, the land belongs to us. And when we can start dehumanizing the land, we get to the point where we can start dehumanizing people, right? So if we start I don't have a job, so that doesn't work for me. So when we get to the point when we start dehumanizing land, we can start dehumanizing people. And this is what we see start when we see our first city starting, right? The other thing that we see starting when we see our first city starting is the rise of othering. Othering is you should worry more about your next door neighbor than you should worry about the people at the top of the hierarchy who don't give a flying and are stealing from you. Because the people at the top of the hierarchy are stealing from you so that they can hoard, right? So how we see this, our oldest documents, so all of that as the start of cities, right? That becomes prehistory because it's pre-written word. When we see the first written word, right, we see the first documents of how kings behaved. And when we see that, it should be understood a lot of the times that what we're doing is building on legends. So just like the sagas don't tell the story of what is going on in 1200, they tell the story of what is going on in 700 and 900. You're seeing that the first written word doesn't tell the story of what is going on currently. It tells the story of what has happened and how we got here. So when you're looking at the first written word, and the first story is written by women, by the way, our first author was a woman. When we're looking at that, you're seeing that the documentation is of kings from before. We can see with the first documentation of kings, Sargon, that we're looking at somebody who probably has narcissistic personality disorder based on the story of their childhood and based on the story of their behavior. So let's touch on that a little bit. When you look at the story of Sargon's childhood, you see a child who was put in a basket to float down a river, was pulled out of that river by a farmer, and lived a very rough, very lacking childhood. And in this very rough, very lacking childhood, we see that I think Jedi's here, Sava's here, Atira's here. Um, if I need others, let me know. I can remove and add some people if I need to. So we see that Sargon is abandoned as a child. And as Sargon grows up in this very lacking environment, because subsistence farming is a lacking space, right? You don't have a lot usually in subsistence farming, where you do have a lot when you're doing honorable harvest or living in animistic connection to the land. Yes, subsistence farming does not give a lot. So you see a child who had been abandoned, who is living in a hard scrabble life, who decides that he is the child of a god. He decides that he is the child of the river goddess, and that is why he was abandoned. And so as he grows older, he uses that to kind of collect people around him and create a kingdom, right? So this is how we see our first rise of this hierarchy based on God kings. Most of us understand the thought process of God kings. We've heard about this. We see this within ancient Egypt. We see this within ancient Assyria. Most of our early kings are God kings. Most of our early kings claim their rulership through being the descendant of a deity. This goes all the way down into the Viking times. We see even Ragnar Lothbrok claimed that he was the child or grandchild of Odin, right? So we see that this carries down for quite some time. I am the child or descendant of a god, and therefore I have the right to rule. This is narcissistic personality disorder. This is the childhood trauma that creates narcissistic personality disorder. This is the idea that you are somehow very special and everybody must actually do for you. And this is having lack and hoarding from that lack, right? Most people only hoard when they've had a lack. We see, like in the 1920s, that the Great Depression and children who grew up in the Great Depression tend to hoard food after the Great Depression because of the fact that they had grown up starving. So children who will grow up with a lack of something will hoard that something when they're older. So we see that this rise of a narcissistic god king, this rise of a hierarchy based on the idea that I am the descendant of a god and therefore I am more worthy than you, is the start of these agricultural based cities. It's very intermeshed with it and it very much has a lot to do with it, right? So what we see these kings do is they hire armies. Those armies are put in place so that they can protect you from the barbarians in the hills, is what I'm telling you. When in fact, I'm taking your food to feed my army when my army is protecting me from your overthrow. Because if I take all of your food and treat you like crap, I need people to protect me from you saying, yeah, nah, bye, bitch, right? So when we see this, we see that the rise of violence and the rise of belonging, of land belonging to you instead of belonging to the land, and the rise of agriculture based on monocrop agriculture and the rise of cities based on hierarchy all go together, right? So, to maintain my control over a city, I need to convince you to give me that control. I need to convince you that I'm not the problem, right? Even as I'm stealing from you, even as I'm leaving you with nothing, I need to convince you that it's not me, it's something else. And so, this is where we see the start of othering. And we see the start of othering start as the barbarians in the hills. The barbarians in the hills are here to steal your grain. And so you need to pay me to pay the army so that the army can. So you need to pay me so that I can pay the army so that the army can protect you from the barbarians in the hills, when in fact, what the army is protecting me from is your rise. You see that this rise of othering first goes to, this is called othering, okay? And this is something that we know very well today. And I'm going to take it from this moment to where we're at today, right now. The rise of othering starts with the idea that the barbarians in the hills are going to steal your food. It translates into that other nation is less than us and they want what we have once everybody starts living in cities, once cities becomes the norm in this area. After we get other, like OTHERING, other, me versus you are the other of me. So we see that once everybody's in cities, it becomes that other city I'm not a socialist, and I'm not purporting socialism. So maybe sit around and listen and you'll get it, right? Um, we see it goes to cities. That other city is out to get you. That other city envies us, and so they're going to steal from us, right? Or the other city has things that we don't have, so we need to go get it from that other city. After we see it starting into that other city, we start to see it go into gender. We see this with the ancient Greeks, where the ancient Greeks decide that women are weaker, and so women are the other within the society. This is the first time we see othering happening within the society instead of the other society is the problem, right? This is where we also see the rise of gender roles as a set thing and a very toxic thing. After this, we start to see religion based othering when we have monotheistic religion rise. And we see when monotheistic religion rises that the othering based on religion is my God says I'm special, so I can kill you. My God says that I'm doing the right thing and you're sinning, so I can kill you. After we see the rise of othering based on religion, we see that the rise of othering starts to become based on race. Now, race has been something that's been debunked, which we're going to go into in about 2 seconds here. I want to talk about how we start to see race in our thought process. We start to see race in our thought process roughly in the early 1400s. We don't start to see it necessarily as it is today, but we start to see the idea that different groups are different races of people. It doesn't necessarily at this time frame mean that other races are less advanced than us. At this time frame, it has a tendency to mean that the other race is not loved by God. Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and something else. One of them is cursed, and so his children are the bad children because God cursed them. And this is where we see that rise of the concept of race coming in. And in the Bible, the mark of the children of Ham comes from the darker skin. And so we start to see the idea that darker skin marks you as being unaccepted by God, right? When we see that the Europeans start invading Turtle Island and Abayala. They first arrive in Abayala, which is South America. When they invade the Arawak people, the Taino people, when we see that this happens, we see that the othering based on religion or the othering based on the idea that you could be cursed by God kind of goes down because we see that the Turtle Island indigenous people and the Abiyalan indigenous people are seen by the Europeans as actually being so close to God in their naivety, in their innocence, in their love, in their care for other people, that they can't be othered based on God hates you because you're doing everything God says you're supposed to do. So you're obviously very close to God and you're, dude, I'm not, I don't fucking care. I'm only going with what the Bible says. I don't believe in the Bible. Like, I don't believe in your God. I think he's a narcissist and an asshole. I'm only going by what your Bible says, right? It wasn't Canaan that was cursed. You can read the Bible. I mean, I have, don't like to, not my favorite place, but it wasn't Canaan that was cursed. Anyways, so when we see that this idea that being darker skin doesn't necessarily mean that you're sinning. Being another religion doesn't necessarily mean you're sinning, and doesn't necessarily mean that. Yeah, it is. See, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not loved by God or cursed by God because they're seeing. In fact, this is one of the theories of the way where Indian comes from is because they're called Los de los Indios, which means the children of God, or Los Deos Indios, which means the children of God, right? Because they are so pure when they are found by the Europeans, right? And because of this, we see this shift into the idea that race really doubles down. I can't decide that you're not close to God based on your religion. So I must decide that you're not close to God based on something else. I must decide that you have problems based on something else, right? And so as we see that, we see that racial thought process starts rising. The idea that different skin colors means different races, means different genetics, means different space in God's mind really starts to rise. Now, in the 1800s, we start to see this idea that the Bible isn't real starting to come into play. When we start to see that there are other humans prior to us, we start to understand that the world isn't 6,000 years old and that God didn't create us. And when we start to see that God isn't the be all and the end all, we now have to double down on what Europeans have been doing. And so you see that Europeans and their idea that science is real and that the Bible isn't real have to really kind of figure out how to justify the atrocities that we've been committing. And so you see that the Europeans decide that the way that they're going to double down on the atrocities that they've been committing is to create race theory and create the theory of eugenics. Now, the theory of eugenics means that you should kill even white people if they're not the picture perfect, right? And the theory of race means that different groups of people are more advanced than other people. The theory of race also states that depending on your skin color will depend on whether or not we are streaming live on YouTube at the same time. So you can go over to YouTube if you want to as well. And all of them are streamed live on YouTube, so you can watch them later. So you start to see this. One second, let me reset my thought process. You start to see that they're trying to double down on the atrocities that they've been committing. And their way that they're going to double down on the atrocities that they're committing is they're going to create the theory of race. The theory of race tells you that depending on your skin color, depends on whether or not you're smart, depends on whether or not you can feel pain, depends on whether or not you're good at sports or you're a hard worker, depends all of these different things that have nothing to do with phenotype, right? So when we see that European academics are creating this theory of race, we absolutely see that this theory of race is created in the idea of how can we actually justify the atrocities that we've been committing, right? So as they justify the atrocities, we see the theory of race kind of developing and kind of moving forward. Eugenics starts around this time. All of these things are seen in Europe and in the United States. The United States and Canada have really founded everything about their countries on this thought process, on the theory of race. And they do this because it gives them the ability to harm people justifiably in their mind. So we know now that the theory of race has been debunked. And so I'm going to go into why the theory of race and how the theory of race got debunked. We just talked about how the theory of race developed. Let's talk about how we got it debunked. In 2010, they started doing the whole genome project. And when they started doing the whole genome project takes a look at the genomes of everybody across the planet, right? And when they sequence the whole genome of people, they actually see that we are more genetically diverse within primary communities than we are between primary communities, which means that if you have been in South Africa for the entirety of this time, you're more genetically diverse from your next door neighbor than you are from somebody, say, in Sweden, who has been in Sweden for 7,000 years, and their family has been in Sweden for 7,000 years. What this is we have like 25 distinct genes or 25,000 distinct genes as sapiens, right? Somebody in South Africa might have 20,000 of those, right? Or say everybody gets 10,000 genes. Somebody in South Africa might have genes 1 through 10,000, and their next door neighbor has genes 10,000 through 20,000, whereas somebody in Sweden is going to have genes 1 through 10,000. Okay. So we can see that we are more genetically diverse within populations than we are between populations. Two other things that we can really see with this. First of all, I want to point out the logic of this thought process. We all know that inbreeding causes mutation. So if your primary population has no genetic diversity, it gets bottlenecked, right? Which means it narrows its genetic diversity, which means mutations start. Okay. So when we're looking at this logically from everything that we know standard, we don't want to inbreed. We want genetic diversity. So having major genetic diversity within a primary population means that that primary population can have children together without causing high rates of mutation of the genetics. So this makes logical sense when you think about it. And then the other thing that I want to point out with this is that my brain is not in its best function today, and I apologize for that. The other thing that I want to point out with that is that we actually see the entirety of all human genes, every possible gene that you can ever happen within the Khoi population in South Africa. You might know it as a Khoisan, but that is a slur, so we will use Khoi or San. That population, that community within South Africa actually has the entirety of the genome within that community. So everything that you could possibly want within the human genome is found in different people within the Khoi population. They're an extremely genetically diverse population, which also makes sense why people in the Khoi population of South Africa are going to have genetics that match somebody in Sweden or somebody in Asia. After we get to the theory of race and we're using the theory of race as othering, and we're moving on, and we get here, especially in the United States, where everybody is so very, 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 very mixed, right? I am so mixed. I come from every corner of the globe. I have ancestors everywhere. There's not a group that I don't actually have ancestry in. There's not a part of the map that there's not dots that state your ancestors were here, right? So when we're looking at that, in the United States, in the Western Hemisphere, this intense genetic diversity or this intense mixture of those intense genetic diversities means that we get to a point where we're like, well, we can't tell who's who anymore for the most part, right? Sometimes we can. Sometimes we can decide, though, most of the time we don't see everything that a person is, just like the person's deciding I'm white instead of understanding that I'm indigenous and very mixed, right? We might see somebody and we might see with our eyes that they look like they're phenotypically Black, but they might actually be indigenous. They might actually have indigenous heritage. They might actually have white heritage. Hi, Citra. Absolutely. And so because of this, we see that the idea that we're divided by race starts lessening a little bit. It doesn't start lessening within the structure. It's still very much within the structure. It's still very much within the political realm. It's still very much within like our cops. It's still very much taught, right? But when we're looking at other people, less and less likely we're going to look at you and go, well, I don't like you because of your skin color. You must be evil, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have spikes, and that doesn't mean that we don't have areas of the country that are definitely still in that stage, right? But what it does mean is that starts to lessen. And because that starts to lessen, we start to see a couple of other things of othering rise. And again, othering, OTHERING. I am me and you are other than me, right? So the next rises of othering that we see immigration become a rise of othering. We are at a state where if you immigrate from another country and we can tell you immigrated from another country, we're going to hate you. It's a country founded on immigrants, but we're going to hate the immigrants, right? And then the next thing that we see is the rise of houselessness and the rise of othering based on houselessness. Houselessness is where you've reached the point where you're no longer exploitable by society. Society likes to, we are all living in a society that exploits you for everything that you have. And in the society that exploits you for everything that you have, when you are no longer exploitable by the society that is exploiting you for everything you have, you can't pay your bills. So you end up houseless, right? You can't take care of yourself because you're no longer because you can't take care of yourself because you're no longer exploitable. And so you become houseless. And so now we are othering people who are houseless. We have decided that the houseless is the problem instead of the exploitation that leads to the houselessness, right? So this is how we see the rise of othering, why we see the rise of othering, and what different stages our perception of how we othered came along. But let's talk about what othering does. Let's talk about who othering protects. Again, when we see that rise of othering happens by the narcissistic God kings in a hierarchical structure, we see that rise of othering is to maintain power. If I can get you to decide that you hate your next door neighbor instead of hate me who's hoarding all of your grain and starving you, then you're not going to overthrow me. There's only one of me. Maybe I have 10,000 in my army, but there's 50,000 of you. So if you decide that you're not going to let me steal from you using my army anymore, you could rise up and overpower me and my army, and I'm no longer the one in charge. So I must keep you down here. So every single time you are sitting here going, you're this and you're that, and I hate you, and Islamophobia and anti Semitism, and you're this color, or you're not this color, or you're that, or you're this, what you are doing is keeping the people who are trying to kill you in power. What you are doing is keeping a government that doesn't give a flying fuck about you in power so that they can hoard everything, so that you can be barely not starving, and your neighbor can be barely not starving, but they're the ones that's taking from you. We saw this a lot in 2020 where everybody decided that Antifa was paid. Nobody ever paid me a goddamn dime, right? When everybody decided that people were getting paid to go out and protest in the streets, and so we're going to hate those people for getting paid to go out and protest in the streets. They're not getting paid. They're fighting for rights. But if I can convince you that I'm paying them behind your back and not paying you, then you're going to hate them instead of hating me. We see this frequently again with the houseless thought process. Houseless people are at a point that they are no longer exploitable by the government. And so they are now at a houseless state. So instead of getting you to see that the houseless people actually need support and help and actually needed a safe space, right? Just a space to pitch a tent in most cases, right? That most people just need a place that they can sleep through the night. Instead of seeing that, the government tells us that they're all drug addicts. The government tells us that they all have mental health issues. The government tells us that all the things that they inflicted on those people are those people's faults instead of the fault of the government, so that you will hate them instead of realizing that it is the government that is causing the problem. Okay. So this is how we get to the point of being able to colonize the entire globe. Because if I, as a narcissistic God king, can tell you that you should go and kill other people so that you can maintain whatever it is, status wise or food wise or whatever it is that you have, so you should go and kill other people because they are a threat to you, I can convince you that I'm not the threat to you. And I can convince you that you need to do all of these things so that you can keep me in power. So when we look at how the Western Hemisphere is colonized, when we look at how the entire world is colonized, this is what we see. Most people don't really realize that the United States starts because of penal colonies. We don't have indentured servitude in the United States after the United States forms. We have indentured servitude in the British penal colonies because the British penal colonies are a place that they send their criminals to, right? And so the British penal colonies are people that are being sent over here because they are criminals, usually because they stole a loaf of bread, right? Usually because they're starving in the streets and they're trying to eat, right? So they get sent over here. Now we've got to maintain control over these penal colonies. So we start sending our second sons over here. We start sending our higher ranking individuals in the stratified society over here so that they can, we're in a space, Britain at this point is in a space where it's limited. Okay. And everybody's supposed to have 10 fucking kids because of the fact that God says we're supposed to procreate. And the land only can go to the firstborn son. What happens to sons 2 through 8? Where is their land? So you see that Britain starts sending sons 2 through 8 elsewhere and stating, here's land over here and you can have this land, right? And so you start to see that this is Britain with the colonies. When you see that United States revolts, that the people here in the colonies revolt, they overthrow the British government and they start to form their own government. What you again see is people who have decided that they need something, they're going to get rid of the controlling factor so that they can have this something, right? Now, when this starts, we start to see things like we need to, no thanks, Widda. What did I say, Jedi? When we see these things starting, what we're seeing is this thought process that, again, we've had race theory starting, right? It is still not scientific yet, but it has already started, right? So we have this thought process of race. Around the same time, we see manifest destiny. Manifest destiny really starts in the early 1400s, and manifest destiny is based on Israel's conquering of Canaan, right? Manifest destiny dates back to Israel conquering Canaan, colonizing Canaan, right? So this idea that God has decided that this land belongs to us, we're the chosen of God, and we get to have this. Oh, the 10 kids, yeah. So when we see this, doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny, doctrine of discovery states that if it's not peopled by Christians, then it's not peopled by humans. So you've discovered it and you can take it. That's what doctrine of discovery states. That's what manifest destiny states. These two things, along with the theory of race, gives the Europeans here within Turtle Island and here within Abiyala this idea that this space belongs to them because God said they should. And not only does this space belong to them because God said it should, but they should be able to take this space that belongs to them because God said it should, and they should take the people within this space and convince them that they should follow God, because if you're not following God, then you're not moral, right? Then you're not following God, because God wants everybody to follow him, even though God only has a couple of chosen people, right? So this isn't where colonization starts in the United States, because colonization starts with the British colonies in the United States. This is where the United States government starts to form and starts their own process of colonization within this space. Because this process of colonization within this space is started with manifest destiny, the thought process of race, and the thought process of the doctrine of discovery, we see that there is this thought process that This thought process of right. It is my right to harm others. It is my right to take this. It is my right to do this, right? And that's where we see this forming. We see this in the Constitution. Noble savages is a phrase in the Constitution. We see that there are phrases in the Constitution that talk about how all men are created equal, but we're not looking at women, and they're not thinking that Native Americans and Africans are men at this point. They're not considering them a part of the man scheme, right? So we see that this um, eating up of the land, eating up of space, this spreading throughout space, right? This need to gobble up as much as they can. We see a stratified society. Now, of course, there's this idea that we don't want a stratified society based on a monarchy because we don't like monarchs. Yet, I would argue that just because it's not a direct inheritance through bloodline does not mean that there is not inheritance through bloodline, right? And I would argue that just because there are, time limits does not mean that these people don't look at themselves as kings. Does not mean that these people don't look at themselves as the be all and end all, right? So, as this spread across the land happens, as this colonization happens, we see again, colonization is replacing a current culture and government with your own culture and government. And this happens, we all know that this happens within the United States and Canada and Mexico, right? That in Turtle Island and in Abya, Turtle Island being North America and Abya being South America, that's exactly what happens, right? Now, this gives many people within this thought process this idea of entitlement, right? This idea that they are born with an inalienable right with no responsibility. Most animistic thought process looks at right as coming with responsibility. So I'm not dealing with Islamophobia in my chat. Okay. Most of the time, in fact, you'd have to point out to me where the Muslims actually colonized another space. There are spaces that people have been Muslim and converted into. Most of Islam is still in the space that Muhammad walked. You'd have to point out to me the spaces that Islam has actually colonized. Coming from somebody who has actually read the Quran, coming from somebody who has been Islamic before, coming from somebody, the Ottoman Empire did not. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire did colonize Palestine, right? But you decided that the Palestinians are actually Arabs, and therefore the Palestinians aren't colonized. And did the Ottoman Empire colonize a land that was not partly theirs to begin with? Or did the Ottoman Empire colonize a land that had already been colonized by their God just underneath another book? And is the Ottoman Empire a colonizing empire, or is it an empire that is fighting against the Christians that are coming in and trying to kill the Ottoman Empire? Now, don't get me wrong. I am not on any level going to tell you that the religious extremisms within Islam are not bad. They are, just like the Westboro Baptist Church, just like all the religious extremism within Christianity, just like IDF and the religious extremism of Israel. All religious extremism is bad. All of these wars, every holy war in history, is started by that God. It's the same God. You're all sharing the same God. You're all sharing the same God. Y'all have the same God. The Torah is in every single one of your books. It is all the same thing. That's true. That is true. That's, yeah, yeah. The Moors colonized Spain. I will give you that. That would be the one place that I will tell you that, yes, you're right. That is absolutely Islam colonizing another country, right? I will give you that one. So they're all the same God, though. And the God is a narcissist who really worships and relishes the death of kids. It's a God that if you're killing kids, he's happy, right? That is the God that if you're killing kids, he's really happy. It's in his books. It's everything he does. His behavior is narcissism. I can point out a series of narcissistic behavior within that God from the Torah, from the original book, from the very beginning. The colonization of Canaan is narcissistic God's actions. Okay. What happened to Job is narcissistic God's actions. Telling Pharaoh, hardening Pharaoh's heart, and then killing him from obeying is a narcissistic God's actions. Okay. What happened with Abraham and Isaiah on the mound? That is a narcissistic action. There is a list of narcissistic actions that God performed. And that God likes to torture people, right? Yeah, Christianity and anything based on the Torah is absolutely a cult. 100%. It's all a cult, right? So, the colonization here within the United States, Canada, and Mexico is based on these theories and this thought process based on this God. It is a Christian colonization, right? And it is based on the thought process that because God said, you get it, right? It's an extremely problematic thought process. And again, colonization is moving into an already occupied land and replacing their culture and government with your own culture and government. And that is where we get all of it. I personally am never going to eat the rich. I believe that you imbue the spirit of the things that you eat, and that's not a spirit I want in my body. The thought process and the theory of eat the rich when they're the ones hoarding everything, though, is absolutely understandable. And I'm fully supporting those who would, right? Personally, I don't want to imbue them, though. They're kind of shitty people, and I kind of not imbue that shit, right? So, hmm, okay. I didn't know Somalia was Islamic. So when we are looking at the way the colonization of this country happens, the spread of the colonization across this country, we're seeing that lies are told constantly. There's an idea that you can claim land, and ethics and morals are completely out the window, right? Ethics and morals are completely out the window. When we're looking at this entire movement across and this entire colonization, we see that there is a lack of transparency, a lack of honesty, right? And we see that there is a lot of hoarding. Again, we see that in a stratified society, when you have somebody who is able to maintain their control, the person maintaining their control is maintaining their control by convincing you that, yeah, I don't know every country around the world. Do you know every country around the world? Like, really? Do you know every country around the world? Because I really don't. It's not my goal. No, I've actually told you where this goes back 10,000 years. And when we see the rise of violence 10,000 years ago, and we're not a violent species before 10,000 years ago. And I've actually shown you where, and we've discussed this. And if you missed it, it is over on the YouTube, right? And we discussed how we can see that rise of violence at 10,000 years ago. And then after we see that rise of violence at 10,000 years ago, we see that rise of othering, we see that colonization of the planet, right? All of this stemming out of Mesopotamia, all of this stemming out of the Fertile Crescent, right? So we get to the point we're at now. Oh, awesome. Did you watch? If you haven't seen the Unknown Cave of Bones on Netflix, you should watch Unknown Cave of Bones. It is about it's about Homo naledi in South Africa, who are a species of hominin or of human prior to us, because they're Homo human. Prior to us, they're from 335 to 235,000 years ago, and they're actually very, very amazing group of people who actually had cave art, who actually had burials. Absolutely, the Druids and the Celts were all colonized. In fact, really, at this point, the entire globe has been colonized at one point or another, right? And this colonization has spread from the Fertile Crescent, right? This idea of agricultural based cities has spread from the Fertile Crescent. And we see that Rome, using Greek thought processes, starts colonizing. And Rome is who colonizes the Celts, and Rome is who colonizes the Germanic people, right? Rome also colonized a good portion of Africa. Rome also colonizes the Levant area, right? Rome colonizes half the world. When we see that Rome has colonized half the world, and at 400 BC or 400 AD or CE, 400 CE, we see that the Council of Nicaea, Constantine decides that the Council of Nicaea and Constantine decide what is the Bible. Christianity becomes a state religion. Christianity is spread throughout everything under Rome's domain. So if Rome has control over that space, Christianity becomes a state religion in that space. And then we see that as Rome starts falling back, Christianity kind of stays in some spaces. We do see that there are many spaces that Christianity doesn't enter into until a little bit later. We don't see that Christianity really enters into the Scandinavian areas until 1000, right? There are many spaces that Christianity doesn't enter in until later. Um, but Christianity and colonization through Rome, and Rome's colonization really starts that global effect of colonization, and then Great Britain picks up the torch, right, and decides that they're going to colonize what Rome didn't colonize, right. In fact, you'd often hear Great Britain talk of themselves as the descendants of the Roman Empire, right? As those who are carrying on Rome's torch, right? And so you see that then Great Britain goes and colonizes the globe that Rome didn't make it to, right? And this is how we see colonization actually spreading across the world. So again, we see that the first colonization really comes within the Middle East. The first colonization is outside of the first Fertile Crescent, taking stuff from the Fertile Crescent to the rest of the Middle East. And then we see that that colonization gets spread to the Greeks, and the Greeks spread that to the Romans, and the Romans spread that to the British, right? And the Britons spread it to the rest of the world, right? Again, we've already just spoke on that. The Islamic colonization that has been pointed out was when when Muslims colonized the Moors, colonized Spain, right? I don't know about Somali's colonization. I do see that Somalia has been Islamic since the 7th century, right? But I don't study Somalia, so I don't know a whole lot, right? But let's talk about, if you want to talk about how Arabs and Islam is doing, we can do that. Like we can talk about how, Christians have been killing Muslims since their inception, right? We can talk about how Judaism Israel has been killing Muslims for quite some time. We can talk about how Muslims were colonized before they tried to colonize anywhere else. We can absolutely talk about that. We've talked about that in a few lives, right? You want to bring that in, I'm totally down for it, right? I would rather talk about where we're getting colonization first, and then I would rather talk about how we get out of this, right? So we've gone over that. How do we get to the point? Listen, every religion based on Yahweh is a bullshit religion based on a narcissistic God. So if you want to bring one of them in, bring all of them in. There are more words of love in the Quran than there are in the Bible, right? So if you want to sit here with your Islamophobia, bring it all in. Let's talk about all of them. Let's talk about all of them. Let's talk about how the first colonization based on manifest destiny was the Judaic colonization of Canaan, who is the ancestors of the Palestinians, who Israel is currently colonizing through a genocide, right? Let's talk about what Christianity has done to the entire globe. Let's talk about what your priests do to children. If you want to bring one of the religions based on Yahweh into my chat, let's talk about all of them, because they are all horrific. All horrific. Every single one of them is based on a God who relishes death. Every single one of them is based on a God who relishes children dying. So if you want to talk about one of them, let's talk about all of them. If you want to talk about, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about how literally every war for the last 4,000 years has been because that God said so. Let's talk about literally every death that has happened in the name of that God for the last 4,000 years, because they number in the multiple of millions up into the billions. There were 100 million people in Turtle Island when the Europeans landed. How many are left? If you want to talk about that God, let's talk about what he's done. Not his followers in his name, because they're all doing the same shit in his name. And they're all doing it in his name. They're all doing it because he said so. A lot of us are still here. I agree 100%. Though our numbers have shrunken drastically from 100 million, right? We can talk about the fact that every single horror in the last 3,000 years, 4,000 years has been committed in his name. Every single atrocity. Every single atrocity since 400 has been committed in the name of that God. Every single massacre, every single bombing has been committed in the name of that God. It's all in the name of that God. He's mean. He worships and relishes death, and he likes to torture you. It doesn't matter if you're Muslim, Christian, or Israeli. It doesn't matter. He likes to torture you. He likes to kill you. He likes to kill your children, and he wants you to kill in his name. He's a God of war and death and destruction for everybody. And so anybody who follows the books based on him does that. It is what he preaches. It is what that God preaches. It is absolutely what that God preaches. Yeshua and Muhammad taught that that was not right, that love needed to come into play. Yeshua and Muhammad taught love, but that God doesn't teach love. That God teaches hate and destruction, and it's in your Bible. It's in your book. It's in your book. Read Exodus. Exodus is a horror story of torture. Exodus is a narcissistic father dealing with two children, one of whom is his scapegoat and one of whom is his golden child. It's in your book. It's in everything. I don't have the Torah outside of the Bible currently, and I don't have a Quran. I haven't had a Quran in years, right? Just because. The New Testament, again, is not God. The New Testament is Yahweh or Yeshua, right? The New Testament is Yeshua's teachings of love, just like the Quran outside of the Torah within the Quran is Muhammad's teachings of love. The Torah teaches destruction and death, and it is the book that they're all based on because they all follow the same God. That's it. Who hasn't had a child bride in that time frame? Mary was 13 when God raped her and impregnated her in a space that she would have been stoned to death. God is a pedophile. So when we're looking at how to decolonize, right? When we're looking at how to, no, I'm actually responding to comments I shouldn't respond to is really what it is, because I do that. When we look at how to decolonize, this is where this becomes important. This is where everything that we have talked about up until this point becomes important. Now, first, it is important to note that unless you are a member of a community that has been colonized and you are in the space of the community that was colonized, you cannot fully decolonize. Now, you can help other communities decolonize, and you can decolonize your brain, right? No, it doesn't. You can decolonize the way you think, and you can decolonize your thought process, and you can help other people decolonize. But if you are, say, of European descent here in the United States and you're only of European descent, you can't fully decolonize without helping Indigenous people here in the United States with the decolonization journey. Okay. You cannot become decolonized until you have reached out to help other people, right? So when we're looking at how to decolonize, the first thing you need to work on is your brain. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I want to go over a few ways that we can do this. One of those things is to look at religion, right? How to decolonize your brain, how to decolonize is to de-indoctrinate. You have to get rid of the indoctrination that you live under. To decolonize the way you think, you have to de-indoctrinate the way you think, right? And so to decolonize and de-indoctrinate the way you think, you have to learn how to think differently, right? So how do you learn how to think differently? One of the big things, that's not true, Rope. God, you just have issues, right? One of the big ways to decolonize the way that you think, right, because it is really, really hard to decolonize the way that you're thinking because you don't know which part of the way that you're thinking is indoctrination, which part of the way that you're thinking is colonization, right? We can't tell that on our own. So to decolonize the way that you think, there's a, it's something that you're going to have to do individually. Like you're going to have to find this individually. I've talked before about energy work, right? And when I talk about energy work, I talk about how I feel it and I visualize it, right? Other people might just feel it, they might not visualize it. Other people might smell it. Other people might picture it. There's several different ways that people work with the same element, right? So I can tell you kind of where to start, but the journey and figuring out how you individually need to do it is going to be totally up to you. It's going to be something that you yourself need to work on. So how do you remove the indoctrination from your thought process so that you can remove the colonization from your thought process? A good way to start with this is to if something is really mainstream or it's taught by a religion, it's most likely something that's been indoctrinated into you, right? If something is something that you're seeing all of society really buying into, it's most likely something that's been indoctrinated, right? If you are, looking at history, right, and you're looking at only those who won, right, you're reading indoctrinated thought process, right? Do you know the difference between colonization, migration, and immigration? Do you know the difference between colonization, migration, and immigration? Let me go back over those because we did touch on them in the beginning, but I realize there are a lot of people here that weren't in the beginning. Migration, immigration, colonization. Migration is something that people will either do as a sustenance pattern, right? They migrate throughout the year to get their sustenance, right? We call these hunter gatherers. Hunter gatherers and collectors are usually the same types of people. They just do their sustenance collecting in different ways. A hunter gatherer is going to migrate with the seasons. A collector is going to stay in one space and go out there during the season. I'm going to go here and camp here 6 months or 6 weeks and get all the salmon. I'm going to go here and camp 6 weeks and get all the berries. And I'm going to bring all of these things back to my central point. So hunter gatherer and collector, they live at the same time. They're often in the same areas. They're just two different ways of sustenance patterning. So migration through hunter gathering is a method of sustenance patterning. The other migration that we deal with is migrating into a space that does not have any other people there. So if you're moving into a space that is not populated, this is migration. As Homo sapien is moving through Europe after Neanderthal dies, this is migration. Now, Homo sapien interacting with Neanderthal in Neanderthal homeland, this is immigration. So immigration is moving into a space that people are already in and becoming a part of the culture that is already present. So if you come into a space that has a culture and you become of that culture, today immigrants will come to the United States and they'll become a part of the United States culture. They'll become United States citizens. They'll go to United States churches. They'll get jobs in United States politics. They will partake in United States business, right? This is immigration. Colonization is when you move into a space that is already occupied and you replace the present culture and governance with your culture and governance, right? So that is what colonization is, moving into a space that is already occupied and replacing the culture and the government within that space with your own culture and your own government. That is what colonization is. So to decolonize is to remove a colonizing party. That does not mean that you are actually recolonizing, because you're not now moving into another space that is occupying it and replacing it with your culture and your governance. You are reclaiming your culture and your governments of that space. So you cannot decolonize by recolonizing. That's not how that works. And I would suggest to you that your idea that that is how that works is you trying to ensure that you're safe, and it is your fear that decolonization means that you no longer have a home. And that's not what decolonization means. I know people from every nation across the United States. I know people from most of the nations in Canada. I know people from Indigenous groups across the globe. I know people from Sami. I know people from different Celtic groups. I know people from Anu groups. I know people from South or from African groups. I know people from Indigenous places across the world who are trying to decolonize and reach their land back state. And in no time have I ever heard a single one of those people equate land back with get out. Land back is returning tending and governance to the people who are originally in that space. It is not you need to go home. The idea of get out or go back where you came from or leave the US, those things are European thought processes. And they come from a very indoctrinated and a very colonized and a very fear-based state of mind because you're afraid that people are going to treat you like you treated them. You understand that the golden rule is true. Treat people how you want to be treated. And you've treated people really shoddily. And now you're afraid that people are going to return it. Right. And that's not what it is. That's not what it is. What it is stop harming me. That's what it is. What it is you're destroying my land that I belong to. And my land is crying out. The land that I belong to is crying out for me to help it. Let me help it before you destroy our species. Okay? So you're living in a state of fear. And I would encourage you to use that fear to become courageous because courageous is somebody who is terrified of something and stands up anyways. Courage is not an absence of fear. Courage is, I am terrified of something, but I know I have to stand up anyways. You can't have courage unless you're afraid. It is not courage if you're not afraid, it's bravado, right? So I would invite you that if you're living in that thought process that you're so indoctrinated that you are afraid that people are going to treat you the way that you have been treating other people, that you start having the conversation in your head to start having courage, to de-indoctrinate yourself, to actually listen to other people, to stop treating people like shit, and maybe actually get to the point of the whole thing, right? Because that's what courage is. It's being terrified and standing up in the face of it anyways, right? So if you truly believe that people are going to treat you the way that you've been treating everybody else, and so you're terrified of things like decolonization and land back because you're afraid that the way you treat people is how other people are going to treat you, then I would invite you to listen to other people and to have a little bit of courage. Just a little bit of courage will lead you really far. So again, to decolonize, you have to de-indoctrinate the thought process that you're living in. And the indoctrination within the thought process that you're living in, we're all dealing with. I didn't grow up in United States society. I grew up in Indigenous culture, and then I grew up out in the middle of nowhere. I didn't reach US society until after I was 12 years old. Okay. I still have things that I was indoctrinated into that are a part of the United States society, right? Don't hit girls. This is a huge thing that we've been indoctrinated into. What don't hit girls tells you is that women are weaker than men. Biologically, that's not true. Biologically, males have stronger upper body muscular attachment and females have stronger lower body muscular attachment. So physically, men are stronger at the punch, but women are stronger at the move. Women can carry more, women can do more, but men can punch harder. That's the only difference. And that's not strength. Strength is endurance. Strength is what you can handle. Strength is how far you can move carrying heavy loads. It is not how hard you can punch. How hard you can punch is how hard you can punch. That's it. But we are indoctrinated into this thought process that women are weaker than men. And so we teach our children don't hit girls. This is an extremely indoctrinated thought process that does not just harm women, it harms men. Now, it makes women think that they're weaker. It makes men think that women are weaker, but it also harms men in the fact that if you're taught not to hit girls and a girl starts beating the shit out of you, if you are a decent man from what you've been taught, you don't hit back. So a woman can abuse the shit out of you and you never raise your hand. You don't even walk away because you're taught that you're supposed to stand there and take it. So often we see men who are violently abused by their spouses that won't even seek domestic violence solutions, that won't even go out and try and get help because they're afraid that they're going to be seen as weaker because she was able to hit him, right? And this is because we are indoctrinated into the idea that you can't hit a girl, even if she's beating the shit out of you, because she's weaker than you are and you can take it. And that's not biologically right. Not only is it not biologically right, but what it does to your mental state as a male and what it does to the female's mental state is horrific. Okay. So, this is one of those indoctrinated thought processes that we're talking about that is doing harm to you, whether you realize it or not. So, you may be able to hit harder, but I can move faster. I'm a war vet. Okay. I'm a war vet. And I've stood front lines on this side because I take my oath seriously, all enemies, foreign and domestic. And we have a lot of domestic enemies, right? So I'm a war vet and I've stood front lines. And so I can tell you, having been in actual combat, that while you might be able to throw a harder punch, I'm going to move quicker than you can. Now, what does it matter if you can throw a harder punch if we both have guns? What does it matter if you can throw a harder punch if we both have swords? You might be able to lift a heavier sword, but lifting a heavier sword does not mean that you're going to hit harder. And it also doesn't mean that you're going to cut deeper. And it certainly doesn't mean that you're going to move faster. I can move faster with a lighter sword, cut you more, and hit just as hard. Right? So when we have this idea that men are stronger than women because men can throw a heavier punch, And we also need to understand, do you know what average is? Average is something that we were all taught in school, but we all seem to have forgotten. Averages is I take 100 numbers and I add them all together and then I divide them by 100. And the resulting number is the average. Sometimes that average isn't even a number that was in the original 100 numbers, right? So on average, men have stronger upper body muscular attachments. And on average, women have stronger lower body muscular attachments. That doesn't mean the majority. That doesn't even mean anybody. It means on average, when you take all the numbers and you add them all together, right? If you can throw a stronger punch and you've been taught that you can't hit girls because you can throw a stronger punch, and so she's beating the shit out of you, does it matter that you can throw a stronger punch? Doesn't matter. You can be a veteran without having served 20 years. Do you know what the word veteran means? It means having served in the armed forces. I was med boarded out after Iraq because of what Iraq did to me. So I didn't serve 20 years, but I was med boarded out and I am disabled and received disability because of what Iraq did, right? So when we are looking at the averages, sure. When we are looking at what we're indoctrinated into, this is one of those things that we've been indoctrinated into, right? This is one of those thought processes that we indoctrinate into. Okay, so, but the thing is that I'm stating, and what I stated in the beginning, this is 10,000 years old. Prior to 10,000 years ago, we were not a violent species. There's no evidence of violence in the archaeological record. We weren't violent prior to the rise of stratified societies, right? This is so that those who are in power can maintain control. Your violence is so that those who are in power can maintain control. Your indoctrinated thought process is actually, you should look that up, because when you look that up, you'll see that trans women aren't stronger than, natural born women. If you actually look up the actual details, right? Being two-spirit, I'm actually on the trans label, and I can tell you that trans women aren't stronger than natural born or that cishet women, right? That's just not factual. You should do some more research. That's something that, again, you've been indoctrinated to believe. That's something that, again, you've been told that you should believe, right? And because you've been told that you should believe it, you believe it, right? We're here to talk about how you believing the things that you've been told that you should believe is harming you. How you believing the things that you've been told you should believe is harming you. And me talking about that as an act of love, not hate, right? You might have been naturally aggressive since childhood. I raised two sons, and I'll tell you, they like to hit things, right? First thing sons do is they play with their penis. It's their first toy. Oh my God, I have a toy. It's attached to me. My diaper's off. I have a toy. It's attached to me. And then the second thing they do is they find sticks and start hitting things, right? Okay. That does not mean that they're aggressive. Hunting is an act of aggression. Hunting is an act of sustenance, right? So if I'm taking a stick and I'm practicing how to throw a spear, I'm practicing how to maintain sustenance. There's a difference there. And we have to recognize that difference. And that's what we're talking about is the ability to recognize that difference. The ability to recognize the difference of what you've been told you are versus who you truly are. We've been told that we're innately evil. We've been told that we're all evil. We've been told that we are the problem. We've been told that we're locusts on this earth, right? But we're not. That's something that you've been indoctrinated into. Biologically, innately, human beings are nurturing and communal. Biologically, innately, human beings are loved, right? So if you are told from childhood, which the church teaches, right? Which most of us here, we're fighting two wolves, right? You have to fight against your worst tendencies, right? You have to work towards being nice, right? You have to work towards being kind. You have to fight against those urges, right? So if you're told that and you believe that that's who we are innately, you can't change it because it's who we are innately. If you instead understand that innately, biologically, we are nurturing and communal, then you can understand that biologically, community is important for us. Nurturing each other is important for both genders and all of the three biological sexes, because there are three biological sexes. So if you can understand that you're not a bad human, that you are in fact a nurturing, loving, and communal human, then you can shift that perspective. You can understand your own worth and your own value. You can stop seeing that you're the problem. Maybe we can stop the high rates of unaliving among young men, right? Because we have extremely high rates of unaliving among young men because they believe these things, because they've been indoctrinated in this thought process that devalues anything about them that is not what we perceive men are supposed to do. Even though what we perceive men are supposed to do isn't true, right? So, we are talking about is how to remove the thought process in your brain that there is something wrong with you. What we are talking about is how self-unaliving club, because I'm talking self-unaliving. I apologize. This is self-unaliving. And last I read, it was not among us, it was among young men, right? Last I read that the within the last 5 years, actually, the unaliving rates, self-unaliving rates among young men has risen exponentially, right? So when we are looking at this understanding that what we're thinking, what we've been told, what we're indoctrinated into, right, isn't the truth, then we can start seeing us for who we truly are. You can start seeing your own self-worth, right? You can stop feeling this overwhelming depression that a lot of us use, or not use, but feel, right? So when we're looking at how to get rid of indoctrinated thought process, the first thing to do is to start recognizing the patterns of things that are indoctrination around you, right? Um, if it's something that you're told that all humans do, it's indoctrinated. Okay. If it's something that you're told that you need to achieve because it's a narrow role that we're all supposed to fit into, it's an indoctrinated thought process. If it's anything that has to do with any religious faith, it's an indoctrinated thought process. If it's anything that your government is telling you, it's an indoctrinated thought process, right? So these are some ways that you can start to recognize indoctrinated thought processes. The other ways that you can start recognizing indoctrinated thought processes, um, start to read from non-mainstream standpoints, right? So if you're reading about the history of what happened here in the United States, instead of reading about the history from a United States standpoint, start reading Indigenous authors or Black authors whose family has lived through the slave trade, right? If you are trying to de-indoctrinate thought processes like women are weaker than men, start reading biological studies, start reading the science that's out there right now, right? Again, there are going to be a lot of different ways that you have to do this on your own. I'm probably going to come up with more. I had different ones yesterday that I cannot remember off the top of my head right now, right? um, but when we start looking at that and start looking at those different things, we can start pulling up more of them. So this really starts at 10,000 years ago when we start to see the rise of violence in the archaeological record. We start to see cities based on Western agriculture, and we start to see the start of stratified societies. And we start to see the start of othering, Othering, I, me, and you are other, which is used by leaders in stratified societies to maintain control over stratified societies, right? Current methods of othering here within the United States are othering based on racial demographic, othering based on immigration, and othering based on houselessness. These are three very obvious current otherings that we have within the United States, right? So we start to see this rise really coming all at the same time, like it's all because it all feeds off of each other, right? And that's when we start to see, and sexuality, not only sexuality, but gender. Gender is a really othering thing here within the United States too, right? Um, and we're starting to see actually that rise even more lately, right? Like the rise of incels, right? The rise of the idea that people are owed something, right? So these are all things that I have archaeological, scientific journal articles based on, right? Things that actually you can see all of these within the archaeological record and all within the scientific record. My conclusion that these are all interconnected is partially mine, but partially what most professors and most anthropologists will tell you, right? Because you can see all of these things rising at the same time, right? Um, and the knowledge that othering rises at the same time, and why othering rises and how othering is used to control us is definitely founded in, like, you can read about it. You've been able to read about it for 50 years. Like, it's something that goes back in its understanding, right? It's in archaeological journals for a long fucking time, right? It's been something that's been really worked over a lot so that we can see it, right? We used to call it Oriental versus non-Oriental, right? But Oriental is a slur, so we don't use Oriental anymore. So now we refer to it as otherism. It was Orientalism before, right? And now we use othering, right? So it is something that you can read in numerous journals. Um, Whether or not you always draw the same conclusions from things that I do, I don't know. I draw the conclusions that I think are logical based on the data given, right? Awesome, Eric. That's awesome. So I can't tell you you're going to reach the exact same conclusions I do. So this is prior to us using Asian. So in the racism that is unfortunately so prevalent within our society and in the structure of race theory, those from Asia were called Oriental. And we see a lot of thought process of Oriental as other, right? And we see this in like the Thousand and One Arabian Nights that gets published, or like Sinbad that gets made into films and things like that. We see this othering really prevalent within it as a cultural structure, right? And so at the point of time when we started to recognize this as a society, we started calling it Orientalism, or Oriental versus non-Oriental, because at that point of time, we referred to Asia as Oriental instead of as Asia, right? And so Asian is a term that comes after Oriental comes into the play. And Asia is a term that isn't used with othering, but used or not, it isn't used in isn't the same as othering, but is actually being referring to a people, whereas Orientalism was othering, right? It was using that verbiage of an entire people to make them other, right? And so that's why we don't use that. We use othering at this point of time, and why Asian is the correct term, where Oriental was never the correct term. It is just the term that was used, right? So when we work on that de-indoctrination of our thought process, that de-indoctrination, no, this isn't. This is anthropology, which is a disciplined science. I don't do psychology. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'll read psychological articles, right, that talk about certain things. That's how I can tell you that I'm pretty sure that Sargon had MPD, right? I, though, I'm not like actually, I'm not a psychologist. I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist, and that's a disciplined science. It's called a soft science, but it's a disciplined science because you can replicate the testing in this science. And science is about being able to replicate your testing, right? That's how it becomes fact, right? Because you can replicate your testing processes. And so archaeology and anthropology are a disciplined science, and they're called a soft science as opposed to a hard science because they're not, well, and they do really deal with chemicals and numbers and things like that. But because they're not perceived to be dealing with chemicals and numbers, they call it a soft scientist. I was going over that, but I can go over it again. So when we're reading about Sargon, I'm trying to think if I can grab that book really quick. When we're reading about Sargon, we see that Sargon is actually one of our first documented kings that we have, right? Prehistory is anything before the written word, and Western academia considers the written word starting with cuneiform. It does start well before that, but Europeans. And so when we look at the very start of history, when we look at the very start of how things are written down, we start to see that, like the sagas are written in the 1200s, but they're not written about people in the 1200s. They're written about people in the 7, 8, 900s. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing that people are looking at stories that were told prior, and they're starting to write down those stories. Let me make sure that I've got the correct one. I might not be able to find Sargon's tale off the top of my head through this book because I don't think I actually marked Sargon's tale, right? But I can tell you what I know across the top of my head. So when we're looking at Sargon, which is really kind of the first king that we really have writing of, what we see with Sargon is that Sargon was abandoned as a child. He was put in a basket to float down a river. And when he was put in this basket to float down the river, he was pulled out by a farmer. He was pulled out by a subsistence subsistence farmer, which is monocrop agriculture, is subsistence farming, especially in its start, right? So, and it's really, and it is very much like the Moses story. All of these are actually very similar. Almost every story that we have of our early rulers, almost all of them follow along this pattern, right? So what we see is that this child is put in a basket to float down the river. He's pulled out of the river by a subsistence farmer, right? This farmer raises him as his own. Now, it should be understood, we're looking at somebody who is barely able to feed themselves, because sustenance farming it doesn't feed people with abundance. It really doesn't. We actually get more abundance from honorable harvest and from actual tending, right, and gathering. But we see that he's being raised in a space where they don't have a lot of food. There's not usually a lot of stuff, and he's having to work hard in that space to make sure, right? And so he grows up to believe that he's actually the descendant of a god. He grows up to believe that he's the child of the god of that river, the goddess of that river. And so, because he's the child of the goddess of that river, he deserves better than what he has, right? If you look at the childhood trauma that creates narcissism, this parallels. This is usually the childhood trauma that actually creates narcissism. Children who are abandoned as babies by their parents have a tendency to develop narcissistic personality disorder, especially if there is trauma associated with it. So, like being left to float down a river and then being raised by somebody who doesn't have enough money to feed you and having to work hard so that you can earn your bread so that you and that person can eat. This is usually childhood trauma that is associated with MPD. And then when you get to the idea that you are better than everybody else, usually we don't think that we're the son of God anymore, though there are some. I've met some. I was married to one. Usually we don't think that we're a son of God anymore as narcissists, but some of them do. But the idea that you're the son or daughter of a deity is really associated with narcissism. I know somebody who's a narcissist who believes that their child is Christ reborn and raised their child in the thought process that they were supposed to heal the world because they were Christ reborn. And their narcissism is that they're the parent of the child that is supposed to save the world, right? So we see that MPD follows along these very, very specific creation story within MPD, within people usually. And we see this with Sargon. Sargon has this, and then Sargon ends up kind of gathering people together and starting a city, right? And he is starting the city based on the idea that everybody should worship him and they owe him, right? And he uses the army that he creates to keep control of that city. And when he's using the army that he creates to keep control of that city, he uses othering to do it, which we also see within narcissism. We'll see within narcissists that if you have a couple of children, you're going to other your children, you're going to pit them against each other, right? We see alienation as well with a narcissist, and that is othering, right? You don't love your other parent, you love me. Your other parent is so mean to you, it's me that takes care of you, right? So when we're looking at our first God kings, we can very frequently see, and almost every king that we have in the start of our kingdoms, every hierarchy start really seems to start with a God king or a God queen. When we see this, we can absolutely see that this is really MPD, right? Now, personally, and I'm not a psychologist, and I barely into genetics and DNA. Like I understand a surface level of these things, and really only as it relates to archaeology and anthropology. Yet, what I see is that we have people who seem to very obviously have had MPD, and because they're at the top of the structure, to have children that get to eat, to have stability, we marry up, right? We all know this. In the time of kings, if you can marry into the ruling class, you're more likely to have good clothes. You're more likely for your children to live through their childhood. You're more likely to be able to eat. So, because we're looking at this need to marry up in a stratified society to maintain stability for ourselves, right? We see that we're breeding with the people that have narcissism. And narcissism has become kind of there's a couple of different things that have to be met for you to get MPD today, right? There is the aggressor gene that you need to have. And then you also have to have childhood trauma. And when you mix childhood trauma with the aggressor gene, those two things create narcissism. The aggressor gene is genetic. And so we see that and again, this is my conclusion from what I see as an archaeologist and an anthropologist, the numbers that we see of this in society today and the way that we're interacting in society today. I look at this and think, well, we kept marrying narcissists who were carrying the narcissist gene. So we started translating that narcissistic gene to our children. Almost everyone on the planet alive today is related to some king of old, right? The children of Genghis Khan are across the globe. Yeah, it's the warrior gene. The aggressor gene is the warrior gene, right? And so almost all of us have descendancy from some king. Most of us are just, almost everybody in a European context is descended from Charlemagne. Well, and that's the thing with that. And that's one thing that we really need to understand. Just because you have the gene does not mean that you become a narcissist. I have genes in my body that state that I can, like, I have genes for immunodeficiency within my bodies, but I'm not immunodeficient, right? Just because you have the gene within your body does not mean that you become whatever that gene says you're supposed to become. Okay. And this is because you have to trigger many of these genes. Many of these genes need a triggering action for them to actually pop, right? So if you have the warrior gene, but you're not, in significant trauma as a child, you're unlikely to get narcissism just because you have the warrior gene. If you have significant trauma in your childhood, but you don't have the warrior gene, you're unlikely to get narcissism, right? You have to have the combination of the two. Okay. So, um, when we're looking at all of this stuff, we can see how it's translated down. We have like 15% of society today, of the people on the planet today, have one of the three personality disorders of the dark triad. The three personality disorders of the dark triad are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And we see that like 15% have this, right? And so with that, we can see that I can see, or to me, it's something that we've bred into society. It's something that we become very prevalent in society, right? So if we see that gene mutation starting in these early god kings, right? This gene mutation starts because of epigenetics, right? So if this gene mutation starts due to epigenetics, right, then they pass that down as everybody's trying to marry into them to be stable, right? Well, I'm sure I have the warrior gene. Like, I haven't looked at that, but I'm sure I do. I come from a family that has a lot of narcissism in it, and I've been in war. I mean, I've always been the person that's going to stand up. Like, I've always been the front of the line, right? That's always been who I am. So I'm sure I have it, right? And I actually have significant childhood trauma. The only reason I know I don't have narcissism is because I worry that I have narcissism, and because my counselors tell me I don't. Like, the only reason that I have worried that I had narcissistic personality disorder. Like, I sat there for a year going, is it me? Am I the problem? Is it me? Am I the problem? So with that, we see that you can actually have the trauma and the gene and not go that way, right? You are absolutely welcome, Davy. You are absolutely allowed to disagree. I ask that if you disagree with something that I have to state, that you tell me why. Like, don't just tell me I'm a liar, and don't just tell me I'm wrong. Say you're wrong because this study shows this, right? So that I can actually go and look it up and see where I might be wrong. I know that I am frequently incorrect, right? Like, I don't know everything. I don't want to know everything. If I were to try and know everything, it would be really hard. It's a little brain, and that's a lot to stuff in it, all the knowledge of the world, right? I'm still seeking as much knowledge as I can every single day that I can. But if you just push everything in, you lose some of it. When I was in school for radiography, my physics professor taught us that you can only have so many penguins on the iceberg. And if you put too many penguins on the iceberg, some of the penguins fall off, right? So I'm aware that, there are things that I could be wrong. There could be new studies out that I haven't seen. There could be old studies that I haven't seen that prove something that I've said wrong. And if you have that information, I welcome you to bring it so that I can adjust what I'm looking at. And so I can adjust my understanding, right? So you're more than welcome to. I just ask that you do it with you're wrong because this is what's incorrect about your argument. This is where you can find that information, right? Because if you're just telling me I'm a liar, or if you're just telling me I'm wrong and you're not bringing any facts that back it up, I'm just going to assume you're a troll, right? I'm just going to assume that you don't really know what you're talking about. You're just triggered by what I'm saying, right? So when we look at that, we can see, that really follows along lines of that indoctrination, right? We can see with that, following along the lines of that indoctrination, how we can work that out, and how we can start to look at those things that we've been indoctrinated in and start to pick out what is an indoctrinated thought process and what isn't. For the most part, everything is an indoctrinated thought process. For the most part, every single one of us, everything we know is an indoctrinated thought process, and we have to learn what the other side of that is. we have to learn what the other side of that indoctrinated thought process is, right? Like we were talking earlier, many people are raised to believe that every human being is born innately evil and that we have to fight against that innate evil. Christianity teaches us, pretty much any book based on Yahweh teaches us, right? That we are innately evil and we have to fight against that innate evil to be good, right? Yet, I would argue that biologically we are all nurturing and communal, and being evil is actually toxic to our species. And species don't biologically develop with things that are toxic to them. They can get those mutations in some of them later on, yet they don't develop speciate with things that are toxic to them. So as a species whole, we are not innately evil. As a species whole, biologically, we are innately nurturing and communal. And this is one of those things where you can see the two different sides, the indoctrinated thought process and what science actually teaches us, right? Another thing is that if it's something that you have been told by many people, it's most likely an indoctrinated thought process. If it's something that you went out and did a whole lot of research on and you learned on your own, it is less likely to be an indoctrinated thought process, which is another reason why I will give you sources, but I need you to go out and look up the information. I need you to take that source and dig deeper because I'm not trying to indoctrinate you. I don't want you to believe what I believe just because I said it. I want you to know in your soul what the truth is so that you can know it, because I believe that by knowing in your soul what the truth is, you as a human being will feel worthier and be less prone to depression and will actually be healthier mentally, right? That's why. And so I'm not trying to get you to believe everything I state. I want you to go out and do the research. I'm just giving you the foundation so that you know what to research, so that you can go out and look deeper, right? Um, so decolonization. Now that we've talked about how to de-indoctrinate your brain, let's talk about how to decolonize. That de-indoctrination of the brain leads to the decolonization of the brain because you get rid of the colonized thoughts. Indoctrination is a foundation element of colonization. To colonize, to maintain control in a stratified society over a group of people that do not want you to maintain control over them, you must indoctrinate them into a thought process that it is okay for you to maintain control over them, right? You must doctrinate them and indoctrinate into thought processes like the thought process that you have the right to life, but no responsibility to ensure other people's right to life. That's a very indoctrinated thought process. Do we all have the right to be alive? Absolutely. That right comes with a responsibility to ensure that everybody else has the right to life too. All rights come with a reciprocal responsibility, right? So if we believe that we have the right to life, but we ignore the responsibility that comes with ensuring everybody else has the same right to life than we do, this is an indoctrinated thought process that we have the right to life while ignoring the non-indoctrinated thought process that there is a responsibility to ensure everybody's right to life, right? So when we have removed the indoctrination, or are we working on removing the indoctrination, because it is a life's journey to remove what you have been taught. If you have been indoctrinated into something, it is a life's journey to remove that. Okay. So, colonization has nothing to do with monarchy. It even doesn't even really have to do with hierarchy, though hierarchy seems to be in play in every colonization that we see. Colonization, let me go over the three definitions again. So, we have immigration, migration, and colonization. These are methods of moving and methods of creating life in space, human life in space, right? Um, if you don't have a heart that beats, you don't have a heartbeat. There's no heart, you have no heartbeat. You just have electrical currents running through your body. And um, a non heart brain possessing, what is the word I'm looking for? Parasite is not a more important life than my life. I'm a living, breathing human being who is able to take care of myself, who is able to perform the basic necessities of breathing on my own. My life supersedes anything that can't do that, right? Migration, immigration, colonization. These are our methods of moving across the globe and methods of moving into space. So migration is moving into a space that you that has nobody in it. So if you're migrating into a space, you're moving into a space that does not have people into it. You can also migrate if you are part of, so animistic indigenous societies have two methods of getting food. And even today, we have a couple of different methods of getting food. Hunter gathering and collecting are these two methods that you see in animistic societies, right? In non-Western agriculture based societies, basically. So hunter gathering and collecting. Hunter gathering is you migrate throughout the year to different spaces so that you can collect the food in those different spaces throughout the year. Collecting means that you have a central place that you live, and throughout the year, you go to the same kind of spaces that you would if you were a hunter gatherer and you collect. You live here, but you go out here for 6 weeks and you grab all the berries and you come home. You live here, but you go over here for 6 weeks and you grab all the salmon and you come home. Whereas if you're a hunter gatherer, you're going to go to the spring to get, or the fall to get the berries, and you're going to go to the salmon run to get the salmon, and you're going to go to, a warm space in the winter, right? So this is migration as a pattern and as a sustenance style, as opposed to just migrating into a space. Immigration is going to a space that is already occupied and becoming a part of the culture that is already there. So, if somebody were to immigrate to the United States, they're going to move to the United States from a foreign place. They're going to become a US citizen or become naturalized to the United States. They might join politics within the United States. They might run a business within the United States. They might join a church within the United States. They might buy a house within the United States, but they are becoming a part of the culture of the United States, right? So that is immigration. Colonization is going to a space that is already occupied and imposing your culture and your government on that place. Okay. So immigration, you don't impose, you become a part of. Colonization, you impose, you take over, your government and your culture becomes the culture of the space, right? Colonization is, I cannot remember a single instance of colonization that I know of that did not happen through violence. And colonization usually tries to genocide the culture that is already there, because that's how they replace it with their culture, is they get rid of it, right? The best way to make sure your culture succeeds in a space that there's another culture is to get rid of that culture, right? So when we are looking at colonization and indoctrinated thinking and how to decolonize, we must start first with the decolonization of our thinking. We must start first with that de-indoctrination of the thinking. The thinking that you are being raised in, the thinking that you grow up in, the thinking that you live in, is a thinking that maintains the hierarchical structure within the place that you live, that maintains people's ability to hoard, maintains your ability to be exploited. Okay. So when we look at anything that is a hierarchy based hierarchy structure, for anybody to be on top, they have to exploit those on bottom. Okay. They have to convince those on bottom to trade their entire lives for something in return, right? Now, when we are looking at different things that we're trading in return through the course of history, we were talking earlier about when we see that foundation of hierarchical life at 10,000 years ago, when we also know, I do have, this is co-streaming on YouTube, so you can listen to it on YouTube later. I also have widdaord.com is my website that is in my profile, and a lot of the information that we talk about is there so that you can go and do research on it from there. I don't really, I have a book that's out that's a treatise on the right to life, and I have a children's book that's out, but I don't really have like all of this done. It's hard for me to function most of the time, and so that requires a lot of effort and function. This requires a lot of effort and function. I can usually only do it for a few hours and then I have to leave. Um, so uh, this starts at the rise of hierarchy at 10,000 years ago. Hierarchy starts at the rise, hierarchy and violence and land ownership, the idea that you can own land instead of belonging to land, and therefore own people. And othering, the idea that you should hate your neighbor instead of the person that's stealing from you. These are all coming at the same time period, right? And so when we are looking at colonization, we see that colonization really needs these foundational ideas to thrive. It really needs the idea that you're supposed to be giving everything to somebody on top because somebody on top is protecting you from your neighbor. Let me repeat that. For colonization to thrive, for a hierarchical structure to thrive, it needs the people down at the bottom to believe that they should give everything they are to those on top so those on top can protect them from somebody else. Now, nowhere in history, which is written word, nowhere in prehistory, do we see that the people on top are actually taking care of the people on bottom, right? In a hierarchical structure like this, we do not see that they are taking care of those on the bottom. What we see is exploitation and hoarding. Now, that does not mean that you cannot have a hierarchical structure that is not based on land ownership, and that can't work. When Europeans got to Turtle Island in North America and Abya, South America, they documented what was going on there. And there are groups that had hierarchy. There are groups that had no hierarchy, but there are groups that had hierarchy. Those groups that had hierarchy, the civilizations that they had, they're documented as having fed everybody. When I was in school, they taught that, or one of my professors, the professor who taught us about the Near East, actually taught us that civilization is when you have an abundance of food. And I would argue that civilization is not when you have abundance of food if you're hoarding it, because that's not civilized. Civilization is when you have an abundance of food and everybody else eats, right? When your abundance feeds the masses, when your elders are all fed and housed, when your orphans are all fed and housed, this is civilization. Okay. So when we are looking at civilization coming out of the Middle East and hierarchical structure coming out of the Middle East, and I say this because we're talking about a foundational idea that comes out of the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, which is in Iraq, right? When we're looking at this hierarchical structure and this civilization idea that comes out of there, what we're looking at is a hierarchical structure maintained by an army that controls the masses, right? Maintained in the control of the masses. And they control the masses so that they can take everything the masses have. When we have sustenance farmers who are all gathered together and the king and the army take all of the grain and they, right, and maybe dole it out just a little bit, right? So when we're looking at today, this exploitation is based on something that's really ephemeral, right? Money is made up. The dollar bills in your pocket have nothing that back them, like literally nothing that back them. There is nothing that solidifies a backing of it. We don't have a gold standard anymore. We don't have actual physical things that cannot be destroyed that are our backing for that dollar bill, right? So that dollar bill is half fabric and half paper, right? So it's made out of fibers from different plant materials, right? And it is printed and made up, right? So you trade everything that you are. You trade 8 hours of your day. You trade it all for something that's made up, right? And for the most part, we all trade it all for something that is made up that we're not even getting enough of to meet our basic human needs, right? The needs that the right to life guarantees us. Because the right to life guarantees us the right to life, which includes shelter, which includes food, which includes water, which includes air, right? Those are the basic necessities for life. And yet your right to life does not ensure that you have those in a society where you are trading everything you are for a return that isn't enough to provide those things, right? So when we're looking at exploitation of the masses, right, we're looking at a group of people who are convincing the masses to hate each other and interfight so that the masses can't see how they're hoarding. We have people across the planet who have more of those made up pieces of paper than they can use in their families in 10 generations if they blow through it every day. And we have people who have no food tonight and no place to sleep. Hoarding, hoarding wealth, hoarding whatever wealth is defined as, while people are starving and unable to live, is absolutely exploitation to hoard wealth, right? So currently, we live in a society where we're all exploited. If you work for somebody else, you're being exploited. Bottom line. And we have to. Don't get me wrong. I'm not telling you to all go quit your job because what the fuck are you going to do? And you think that you're trading it for something that's permanent, yet somebody can take your car away tomorrow. Nobody's going to stop them. Somebody can take your land away tomorrow. That's eminent domain. The government can come in and kick you off your land and put a road or a pipeline through it tomorrow. So all the things that we think that we own, we don't actually own. Somebody can take them away from us tomorrow. They're not tangible. They may feel tangible and they may look tangible, but they can be removed from us tomorrow. So they are not tangible. So you're turning over your labor, you're turning over your body's ability to function, right? Because anybody who's performing any kind of physical labor, every bit of physical labor you are performing is wearing down your body's ability to function at a later point in life, right? The military destroyed my body, right? My partner is an MMA champion, right? All the fighting that my partner did has wrecked his body, along with the fact that my partner has been working in warehouse management and warehouse work for 15 years. And so my partner has been doing a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of heavy interaction. And all of that has worn down his body to the point that he's in pain half the time, right? So all of this that we're trading for nothing is wearing us out. Hunter-gatherer cultures actually, they've done studies like the Kung people, when they studied the current hunter-gatherer societies that we have out there today who are still living in a hunter-gatherer cultural society, the studies show that hunter-gatherers, their workaholics work 16 hours a week to provide sustenance for the entire group. Most people work 5 hours over the course of the entire week to provide sustenance for the community. Those who really like to go out and hunt might work 16 hours over the course of an entire week. And yet you're working 8 hours a day to 16 hours a day in exchange for not enough to pay your bills. That is exploitation, right? And it's a global problem, Sundance. I mean, I'm sick of it too here. And I know so many people who want to leave, but we've got to find a place that it's not at, right? Where is it not at this point? I mean, you can go to one of the more socialistic based countries and you can be a little bit easier off, right? Yet you're not going to be completely easier off because even current socialism, just like current communism, is based on capitalism. It is all based on capitalism. It all has a hierarchical structure, which is why current communism doesn't work, because it's not true community. It is instead capitalism couched as communism, right? So how do we get rid of this? How do we get rid of our need to be exploited? How do we get rid of, the control that we're under? How do we get rid of the indoctrinated thought? How do we actually decolonize? All of this leads to how do we actually decolonize, right? If you are a European descendant only here in America, you cannot decolonize outside of decolonizing your brain unless you are going to a nation that is under colonization and helping them to get out from underneath colonization. Okay. And I want to always explain what I mean by this. First, you need to work on that de-indoctrination of your thought process and that decolonization of your thought process. Okay. And then take a list of your skills, the things that you're really good at, right? And go to whatever the local tribal nations are, the local nations office is, the local nations council offices. And you say, my skills are carpentry and oration. Is there anything that I can do to help you get your land back, to help you decolonize, to help you with sovereignty? Is there anything that I can do with this skill set to help you? Now, why do I say take your skill set in? Because it's a lot of labor for me to decide and ask you and ask you and ask you, well, can you do this? 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 So taking your skill set in and showing what you can do up front means that you can actually look at, or they can actually look at what you can do and see where you can fit into what they need. And then the other thing that you really need to look at this is, do not ever go into a space and go, I know what you need, because you don't. You think you do, but again, you're looking at working from an indoctrinated, colonized thought process. So while you think you might have the ideas of what somebody else needs, we never have the idea of what somebody else needs. We have to ask people what they need to know what they need. Every time we decide what somebody else needs and we impose our thought process of what somebody else needs on them, we're actually being extremely unhealthy and we're actually causing harm. Because if you think that I need to eat, but I can't eat breakfast because every time I eat breakfast, I throw up, and you're going to try and force me into eating breakfast because you think I need to eat breakfast because you need to eat breakfast, then you're doing my body harm because I'm going to take it in and I'm going to go throw it up. And now I've thrown up and I'm more likely to not be able to eat for the rest of the day. Whereas if you had let me not eat breakfast and sit down for a couple of hours and maybe smoke a bowl so that I could actually eat, I'm going to actually be able to eat. Right. So when you go in and decide that because it's something that you need, somebody else needs it, you're causing active harm. So if you are working on decolonization and de-indoctrination, you work on yourself and then you take your skills and you go to those who are colonized within this space and you go, what can I do? This is my skill set. What do you need? Right? How can I help? I want to ensure that you're safe, that you get what you need. How can I help? 93,638 Indian preference and tribal nations. I don't think I've heard of that. That would be why I'm forgetting it, right? Yes. Okay, so I see what you're saying, but that's not actually forgetting that. So that gives nations the authority to contract with the federal government to operate programs serving their tribal members and other eligible persons. Me going to a nation and going, what can I do to help, isn't circumventing that. That's giving the nation resource, right? Just because a nation goes to the federal government to get different things from the federal government doesn't mean that those different things are actually going to meet the need. Maybe if they're going and they're getting money from the federal government to build a school and I can do carpentry, they can save that money to put furniture in that school because I'm doing carpentry, right? So, um, colonization is actually capitalism. Capitalism is the idea that you can trade capital for labor, right? That's what capitalism is. It's trading capital for labor, right? And so any nation founded on the idea that you can trade capitalism for labor, most colonization actually comes from people who believe that they can trade capital for labor, right? Or that they can trade capital for protection, or that they can trade capital for anything, right? So really, there's not a there's really not like a in control nation around the globe that doesn't actually have capitalism really inherent in it. Even communism, modern day communism has capitalism. Even modern day socialism has capitalism, right? Um, so it is 21st century colonialism, 100%. And I'm not disagreeing with that. What I'm saying is that capitalism and colonialism aren't separate. Capitalism and colonialism are, in fact, intertwined. The idea that you can possess capital is necessary for colonization because capital is land, capital is people, capital is food, right? And so when we colonize, we're taking these three things, right? And so when we're colonizing and taking those three things really become capitalism and colonialism are very interchange. They're not interchangeable. They're very intermeshed, right? They're really much the same thing, right? So, um, when you're going to a local nation and you're stating, these are my skill sets, what can I do? Like I recognize what is going on, and I need to see that, you're actually able to, that you get what you need, right? Hold on a second. My cat's scratching, trying to get out of my bedroom. You're like, I'm done cuddling with daddy. I'm done. Just done, mom. I'm done cuddling with daddy. I grabbed a drink while I was at it. So this really gives us an idea of how we can first decolonize our mind, right? De-indoctrinate our methods of thinking, and then how we can actually help with the function of decolonization, right? Now, we do have countries in the world who have overthrown their colonizers. Zambia is one, I think. It's Zambia or Zimbabwe. They're both C's. But one of them has actually overthrown their colonizers, right? We have to overthrow the colonized thought process along with the overthrowing of the colonizers, though, right? We can't overthrow the colonizers and then sit in the same capitalistic thought process. It doesn't really do a lot of change, right? And a part of the idea behind decolonization, and a part of the idea behind, you can think my food's going to be taken first, but honestly, you could drop me in the middle of the woods and I would thrive. I grew up in the middle of the woods. I can out hunt you. I can out tend you. I can make anything I want from anything around me, whether it's basketry or clothing or a house or tools or anything, right? Like I grew up off grid, backwoods, and dirt floor fucking poor. And I grew up like we lived in a bus for one winter. And that winter, I actually had gone to school for a little bit that year, which was not very frequent. I'd go to school maybe a month out of the school year before we get snowed in. And I remember thinking that Santa Claus was going to come to the bus. And I asked Santa Claus for a full leather outfit. Like I had been making some of them, but I wanted all the leather to make myself a full outfit and an AM FM radio, right? Like I have known how to live off the land since before I could walk. It's literally how I was brought up, was how to live prior, like how to literally live off the land in an animistic sense, right? So you can think they're going to take from me first. They've already taken really everything from me. Like I've already lost everything in this world, right? A couple of times. And yet, as all resilient people everywhere, I have the ability to thrive. And you could drop me in the middle of the woods. If you took everything away from me today, I would disappear. I'd go into the middle of the woods. I would build myself a house because I know how to build myself a shelter in the middle of the fucking woods with a knife alone, right? I would go in the middle of the woods and I would build myself a shelter, and I would thrive in a way that I am not thriving today. I would thrive in a safe way that I am not thriving today in an unsafe society, right? So you can assume that because that's you. If they took away your food, you would have a problem. But you could take everything away from me and I would be okay. I've built houses. First house I built, I was 7 years old while I helped my parents build the house that we had. The first house I lived in, I helped build. And I was an engineer in the military, which means that I know how to do construction as a military standpoint. I was raised by two laborers who did construction. I have actually, when I was in Standing Rock, created the shelter that I lived in for part of my time in Standing Rock by weaving branches together, packing mud in between them, and putting a tarp roof on it because there weren't enough like leafy frond things for me to put a tarp roof on. So not only could I, but I have done it several times. Just saying. You really need to like attack people that you know what the fuck's going on. Because when you start attacking people, you have no clue what the fuck is going on. I don't vote. I don't believe in the government. I'm trying to overthrow the government. I don't vote. And I am not a liberal and I'm not a leftist. It doesn't get far enough left for me in this country. I'm indigenous. I am land back and I am burn it to the ground. You can vote, right? And again, I don't want to eat the rich. I want everybody else to eat the rich. If you want to eat the rich, eat the rich. I just want the rich to go away. Personally, I would not eat the rich because I personally believe that you imbue the spirit of whatever it is that you eat. And I don't want that spirit in my body. I ain't coming close to imbuing that nasty ass shit. Sorry. So, this is how we can get through that indoctrination of our brain. This is how we can get through the decolonization of space, right? This is how we can get to a different viewpoint. We like to think that we can't change, but the only thing human, like there are very few things that separate us from anything else, right? One of those things is that we adapt our adaptations. One of those things is that we are biologically nurturing and biologically communal. Other species are biologically nurturing and biologically communal. Yet, our biological nurturing community has everything to do with the life stages that our children go through from neonate to adult. We have 5 of them. We're the longest of any species out there. Some species don't even have, like, you're born and you're gone, right? You're a snake, you're born, you're gone. You're out the egg, you're gone, right? We take 25 years to actually reach full function, right? To where we're supposed to be able to be completely independent on our own. Not that anybody should ever be completely independent on our own. We absolutely must interact. Tribalism, so that's a misnomer. So, what is the alternative to colonization? Tribalization or tribalism. So, we like to think of tribal as meaning a certain lifestyle. That's not what tribal means. Tribe means a community based on genetic lineage, right? The US is kind of a tribe in a way, right? Because well, we can bring people in from outside where we allow immigration. Your citizenship is based on your genetic lineage, right? Based on being born here, based on who your parents are, right? We do have the ability to be born here and be granted citizenship to be born here, but a lot of those laws have changed, which means you kind of have to have your parents have citizenship, right? The whole the whole stuff that went on during Trump's presidency, right? So, um, a tribe is a community based on genetic lineage. Okay. And a band is a community based on not genetic lineage. These are the definitions of these words. Okay. Yeah. And that's why I said, but it's not so much anymore. Like you can be born within these borders and not be a citizen now because of what happened during the last presidency. Right. So, what is the alternative? And that's what we're talking about. So, we like to think that we can't change. We like to think that this is who we've always been. This is who we always have to be. But change, right? Change is very much a part of who we are as a species. We are constantly changing, constantly evolving in our thought process. That's one of the things that's very unique to us, that our brain has the ability to change constantly, to adapt to new information on a constant basis and retain that new information, and then take that new information and change that new information into something else. So change is extremely innate to humanity. We are extremely changeable. And in fact, it is one of the things that you can be guaranteed. The 2 things that you are guaranteed are not death and taxes. Death and change are the 2 things that you can be guaranteed. I'm not going to get to the point until I'm ready. If you think that you get to come into my space and tell me how to talk, then you should scroll the fuck on. I'm going to explain my point, how I want to explain my point. And you should listen to it because I'm explaining it so that you can understand it. Okay. So we are changeable constantly. Change is who we are. And as I said in the start of the live, and as I've said a couple of times, we see the rise of violence at 10,000 years ago. We see the rise of stratified society hierarchy at 10,000 years ago. We see the possession of land instead of being belonging to the land start 10,000 years ago. We see othering start 10,000 years ago. These are all things that were a drastic change in our concept, a drastic change in who we are. 300,000 years ago was our first human, so sapien, not human, because other species are human too. But our first Homo sapien is 300,000 years ago. So 290,000 years of living as animistic peoples without violence, who are interacting with every other group of human that they come across in a positive manner, enveloping people into them and being enveloped by people, right? Every time we saw another species, we intermixed with them. We either enveloped them into us or we became enveloped into them. That's how we have Neanderthal DNA. That's how we have Denisovan DNA. That's how we have the 6 different ghost species DNA that we have within us, right? Every time we come across another human being, we intermingle, we intermix with them, right? Another human species, right? So for 290,000 years as a species, we lived in an animistic thought process. We lived in connection. Yes, anything that has the genus Homo is a human. So we're like Paranthropus boisei isn't a human, but Homo erectus is a human because Homo is Latin for human. So in that 290,000 years, we're living in this thought process of animism, what we call today animism. We didn't call it then, we just called it human, right? Animism is the belief that we fulfill a niche within the environment. Animism is the belief that the entire biome works together and that the entire biome is a living, breathing entity, right? That the earth itself is a living, breathing entity, and all the animals and the plants within the earth, all the animals and plants within the biome, including the earth itself, are living, breathing entities. And we are just another part of the function. Like the tree has a niche, like the wolf has a niche, like the worm has a niche, human has a niche. No, Homo equals human. Homo sapien is the species that we are, and Homo sapien are 2 different words. Homo is the genus, which means human. Sapien means wise, and it is the species. Homo neanderthalis, Homo means human. Neanderthal means Neander Valley because that's where they were found originally. Homo erectus is human who stands upright. Homo habilis is handy, habilis, man, human, right? So you saw that? So, but we are, the species that we are is absolutely, actually our species is Homo sapien sapien. We're wise. And why are we wise? The mental eminence on our chin. We're the only species that has this mental eminence on our chin, and taken from the statue of David, who's wise and thinking, right? And so when they found that they started finding other species and they see that we're the only species that has the mental eminence where David is holding his chin, basically, or touching his chin, right? That's why they decided to call us sapien, because we are wise, right? So, right. Well, and it's not that we're not wise. We're still wise. It's that we've been indoctrinated into believing something that's not true. It's that we've been convinced that we're stupid. It's we've been convinced that we're something we're not, right? So prior to 10,000 years ago, and in many spaces, this actually still exists because there are indigenous cultures across the globe that are still existing that have not been colonized, right? So prior to 10,000 years ago, we are an animistic species. Animism, again, just believes that we're just a part of the biome. We all fulfill a niche in the biome. Now, I want to state here, because of the fact that I always have people within my chat who are really offended by the idea that we're just an animal and are really offended by the idea that we came from apes. We don't descend from the apes. We descend from Homo erectus, which is a human, right? We share a common ancestor with the apes that doesn't look like the apes, that isn't an ape. Okay. We descend from Homo erectus, which is a human being. We are primates, but we are not apes. We're not even in the same taxon as apes. We're not even in the same taxon as chimpanzees. We have a unique taxon, and we don't descend from chimpanzees. We grow alongside chimpanzees, just like we don't descend from lizards. Mammals and lizards have a common ancestor that looks like neither of them, and they both descend from the same common ancestor at the same time. Homo erectus doesn't come from apes. Do you know who Homo erectus comes from? Homo erectus comes from Homo habilis, Paranthropus boisei, and what is Lucy? I want to say Australopithecus, but it's not. It's Australopithecus, right? Which don't look like apes. Homo habilis didn't look like an ape. Okay. We have a recent common ancestor with Neanderthal, and that recent common ancestor is Erectus. We don't have a recent common ancestor with chimpanzee. We're not even in the same taxon as chimpanzee. Okay. We descend from human. We descend from Homo erectus. Homo erectus comes from Paranthropus boisei, Homo habilis, another human, and Australopithecines. We come from Homo heidelbergensis, Homo antecessor, Homo ergaster, and Homo erectus. These are all human species, right? So, and the reason that I'm stating this is not that we're not animals. We are animals. We are primates. We are mammals. We belong to the taxon Animalia. We are absolutely animals. But why I'm stating this is so many people are like, I'm not a fucking ape. You're a fucking ape. We're not apes. We're not even in the same taxon as the great apes, right? We are cousins, maybe, but we're not apes. And we didn't descend from apes. We descended from humans. I'd invite you to look at the Taxon Academia. I'd invite you to look at the Taxon. Hominini is from the taxonic tribe of the subfamily Homininae, homininins. Hominini includes the extant general Homo, humans, and pan, chimpanzees and bonobos, and in standard usage excludes the genus gorilla. Now, genus is Homo, right? Tribe is a step up from Homo, that's Hominini. And the two groups underneath the tribe Hominini are Homo and Pan. Okay. When you go up to Homininae, the subfamily, this is where you get the great apes or the African apes, which are a subfamily of Homininae, right? And it's a different subfamily. The ancient species that both of those groups descend from is not either of those groups. Let me repeat that. The ancient species that both of those groups descend from, and again, this is several steps up in the taxon, the ancient species that both of those groups descend from does not look like either of those groups. Our split from the common ancestor that we share with chimpanzee, again, tribe, 2 steps up in the taxon, okay, and not great apes, okay, doesn't look like either one either. And that's 7 million years ago. And that's in Chad in South Africa. Okay, you can study it. Do you have a degree in it? Because this is my degree. This is what I study. This is like paleoanthropology is what I do. So unless you have a degree on it, and unless you can show me where the information that I have is completely incorrect, right? Then no. So And again, even in what you're stating, the gorillas and us, the gorilla's not here and we're their grandchild. Grandpa is something else, and that's what you seem to be missing. Neanderthal and sapien, right? Neanderthal and sapien aren't the same species. They're both Homo, so they both fall under the same genus, right? And they both descend from, if you push it far enough back, the same species, right? So Neanderthal is thought to have come from Homo heidelbergensis, who are in Europe, and antecessor, who are in Europe, right? Both Homo heidelbergensis and antecessor, who are in Europe, come from Homo erectus, okay? Homo sapien is now known to have descended from heidelbergensis, antecessor, ergaster, erectus, and a couple of others, right? So while we share a common ancestor with Neanderthal, we don't descend from Neanderthal. Do you see what the difference is? Yeah, and we share 95% of our DNA with bananas. Are we descended from bananas? Right. So do we descend from the bananas? We don't descend from gorillas. We don't descend from apes. We share a common ancestor. That's the difference that I'm trying to point out that you might not be getting, right? I am not saying that we don't share a common ancestor. I am saying that we don't descend from. Just like we don't descend from Neanderthals, we share a common ancestor with Neanderthals. Just like we don't descend from lizards, mammals and lizards share a common ancestor, right? So that's what I'm stating, that we don't descend from gorillas. We share a common ancestor that we both descended from, and we descend from human Homo erectus, because that is our grandfather as a species, right? That's true, Doug. There are actually two different caves in the Levant area, right? That actually we can see that Neanderthal and Homo sapien lived side by side together for 100,000 years. And side by side together in that 100,000 years, that time frame is actually a point where we actually get a whole lot of our changes of information. It's also the time frame when we all start burying our dead. It's also this time frame where we start doing art, and it's this time frame where we start doing body self identification. Like we start decorating our bodies so we can self identify, right? So that human didn't descend from an ape either. Australopithecine isn't an ape. Homo erectus didn't descend from an ape because Australopithecine isn't an ape. And Homo habilis isn't an ape. And Paranthropus boisei isn't an ape. None of those species fall underneath the same taxon as the apes do, right? As gorilla. None of those fall underneath the same taxon. So to find the common ancestor of us and chimpanzees, not us and gorillas, but us and chimpanzees, the common ancestor between us and chimpanzees, or one of the missing links, is 7.5 million years ago, and it's found in Crete. And it is, fuck off my head, Graciopithecus freibergi. What group is human in? So our tribe is hominini. And the only other group within that tribe, there are two groups within the tribe hominini. They don't descend from each other, right? They share the common ancestor of Graciopithecus freibergi, and that is us, Homo, any genus Homo species, and Pan, chimpanzees and bonobos, right? Great apes aren't in that. You have to go further back for that. I need to answer a call. This is the VA. Give me a second and I will be right back. Hold on, YouTube. Hello? Hey, can you hear me? 1 second, Judy. 1 second. Sorry, my phone does not work in my house. I have to move outside. 1 second. Hold on 1 second.